What if I told you that you wouldn't survive a single day in a world ruled by dragons? Not because you're weak, not because you're unprepared, but because every instinct you've developed for staying alive is designed for a world where humans are the apex predators. And in the world I'm about to describe, you most definitely are not. Now dim the lights. Let your body sink into whatever comfort surrounds you right now. Feel the softness beneath you, the clean air filling your lungs, the gentle hum of electricity keeping your world predictable and safe. Hold on to that feeling for just a moment longer. Now imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where dragons are real. Not the glittering, wise creatures of children's stories. Not the magnificent beasts that bow to chosen heroes or grant wishes to the pure of heart. Real dragons. Ancient, indifferent, and utterly unconcerned with your existence, except as something small and breakable that happens to share their territory. And when they speak, not in words, but in the primal language of creatures who have never known fear, announcing their dominion over everything that dares to breathe in their presence, the sound that emerges from their throats is pure, distilled terror made audible. You are not special in this world. You are not the prophesied one, destined to ride the winds and command fire. You are not a knight with blessed armor or a wizard with ancient knowledge. You are exactly what you are right now, a person who knows how to operate a coffee maker, navigate traffic, and complain about Wi-Fi speeds. These skills will not serve you well when the sky darkens with wings. Your expertise in parallel parking will be utterly useless when the primary concern becomes whether you can squeeze behind a boulder fast enough to avoid incineration. In this world, you are made of meat. Soft, vulnerable meat that burns easily and breaks with remarkable little effort. Your bones are hollow sticks compared to the casual power that moves through the air above you. Your skin is paper-thin against claws that can split stone. Every breath you take is borrowed time. Every heartbeat a small miracle that you've managed to avoid notice for one more moment. The dragons are not evil. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand. They are not motivated by malice or driven by some ancient grudge against humanity. They are simply nature, operating by rules that existed long before your species learned to make fire or speak in more than grunts. They are weather patterns with wings, geological forces with teeth, the living embodiment of every natural disaster that has ever reminded humans exactly how small they truly are. Some breathe fire that can melt steel from 100 yards away. Others exhale cold so absolute it can freeze the moisture in your lungs before you can scream. There are dragons that spit acid capable of dissolving stone, and dragons whose very presence drains the warmth from your body until your blood moves like syrup through your veins. Each variety has evolved to dominate its environment completely, and you unfortunately happen to live in several of those environments at once. You might think your intelligence gives you an advantage. After all, humans have always survived through cleverness, through tools and cooperation and the ability to plan ahead. But intelligence requires time to implement. And dragons don't typically provide you with the luxury of sitting down to think through your options. When something the size of a house decides to rearrange the landscape around you, your carefully laid plans tend to become irrelevant very quickly. The worst part is not the dragons themselves, but the world they have created simply by existing. Every human settlement is built around the fundamental truth that death can arrive from above at any moment, without warning, and for no reason you could possibly understand or influence. Cities are half bunkers, houses are temporary shelters, and every road between them is a calculated risk that people take only when they absolutely must. Food is scarce because dragons don't particularly care about the difference between a wheat field and a forest when they're establishing their territory. Water sources are frequently contaminated by the byproducts of their presence. Ash, chemical runoff, or simply the terror sweat of creatures that died nearby. The air itself carries the constant reminder that you are not the dominant species here, thick with smoke and the distant sound of wings that might be miles away or might be directly overhead. You will adapt to this world if you survive long enough, because humans are remarkably good at adapting to terrible circumstances. You will learn to sleep through the sound of distant roars. To recognize the difference between the wing beats of a dragon that is hunting and one that is simply passing through. You will develop an instinct for when the air pressure changes in that particular way that means something very large is about to land nearby. You will also learn to live with fear as a constant companion. Not the sharp, adrenaline-fueled fear of immediate danger, but the low, persistent fear that lives in your chest like a second heartbeat. The fear that makes you check the sky every few minutes, that makes you hesitate before opening a door, that makes you count your heartbeats in the silence between one breath and the next. This is not a fantasy. This is not a story where courage and determination triumph over impossible odds. This is a world where physics work exactly as they do in your world, where your human limitations are exactly what they are right now, and where the creatures that rule the sky are bound by no such limitations at all. But you are not there. You are here in your soft bed or comfortable chair, breathing clean air and surrounded by walls that have never been tested by dragon fire. Your biggest worry tonight might be whether you remembered to charge your phone or what you have to do tomorrow at work. These are beautiful, mundane concerns that exist only because you live in a world where the sky is empty of anything more threatening than weather. So settle back into that comfort. Feel the safety that you rarely think about because it's always there, reliable as gravity. In a few minutes, you'll step into that other world, where every sunrise is a small victory and every sunset is a relief that you've managed to avoid notice for one more day. The dragons are waiting. Your shelter is not a home. It's a calculated compromise between the need for protection and the reality that nothing you could possibly build would actually protect you. The walls are stone, thick enough to muffle sound, but not thick enough to stop anything that truly wants to get in. Every surface is stained with soot, a fine layer of ash that settles on everything overnight like a gray snow that never melts. You built it low to the ground because height attracts attention. 3 feet of clearance above your head when you're lying down, maybe 4 when you're sitting. Tall enough to be human, low enough to be ignored. The ceiling is flat stone slabs that you dragged from the ruins of some previous optimist's more ambitious construction project. Someone who thought they could build something permanent in a world where permanence is a luxury that only dragons can afford. Sleep here is not the deep, restorative rest you once knew. It's a series of brief, unconscious moments strung together by periods of listening. Your body has learned to process the sounds of the night, to sort the dangerous from the merely unsettling. The scratch of small creatures moving through the ash outside your walls is normal. The low rumble of something large shifting its weight in the distance is normal. The sound of wing beats passing overhead is normal, as long as they keep passing. But your body knows the difference between normal and not normal with the precision of a survival instinct that has been refined by months of practice. The sudden silence that falls when every smaller creature simultaneously decides to hide is not normal. The vibration that runs through the ground when something extraordinarily heavy lands nearby is not normal. The way the air pressure changes when something very large is breathing just outside your walls is definitely not normal. Heat pulses through the stone around you in waves. Not the gentle warmth of sunlight or a well-built fire, but the oppressive, skin-drying heat that radiates from creatures whose internal temperature runs several hundred degrees higher than anything that should be walking around alive. During the day, this heat makes the inside of your shelter feel like a kill. At night, It's the only thing that keeps you from freezing as the temperature drops and the stone walls bleed warmth into the cold air. The ground vibrates when they land nearby. Not the sharp impact of something falling, but the deep, resonant tremor of something that weighs several tons settling itself deliberately onto the earth. You feel it in your bones, a sensation that starts in your chest and spreads outward until your teeth ache with the frequency of it. The vibration travels through the stone, through the ground, through your body, reminding you that you are sharing this space with creatures whose mere presence can shake the world around you. Your first sound of the day is never an alarm clock or the gentle stirring of a household waking up. It's a distant roar that shakes the dust off your ceiling and sends a cascade of fine particles drifting down onto your face. Not the theatrical roar of a movie monster, but something deeper and more complex. Part warning, part territorial claim, part simple expression of a creature that has never learned to modulate its voice for the comfort of smaller beings. The roar starts low, a rumble that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. It builds slowly, gaining layers of harmonics and overtones that speak to some part of your brain that still remembers when your ancestors were prey animals. By the time it reaches its peak, it's loud enough to rattle the loose stones in your walls and make your ears ring for several minutes afterward. Then it fades, leaving behind a silence that seems even more oppressive than the noise. You lie still for several minutes after the roar fades, listening, not just with your ears, but with every sense you have. The quality of the light filtering through the narrow gaps in your walls tells you whether the sky is clear or filled with smoke. The temperature of the air tells you whether something has been breathing fire nearby. The smell tells you whether you're sharing the morning with the living or the recently dead. The air already smells of ash because the air always smells of ash. It's a fine, acrid dust that gets into everything, your clothes, your food, your lungs. You've learned to breathe shallowly, to filter the air through cloth when possible, to clear your throat quietly so as not to announce your presence with a coughing fit. The ash is not just the residue of fires. It's the pulverized remains of everything that couldn't survive the casual destruction that follows in the wake of creatures who reshape the landscape by simply existing in it. Your bed is a pile of salvaged fabric and hide arranged on a stone platform that keeps you off the ground. Not for comfort. Comfort is a concept that belongs to a different world. But because the ground is where the smaller scavengers move at night, things that are drawn to the warmth of sleeping bodies, things that are always hungry, things that have learned to associate the sound of human breathing with an easy meal. The platform is also positioned so that you can see the door from where you sleep. Not that you could do anything if something decided to come through that door, but the illusion of readiness helps. Your hands know where your few possessions are in the dark. A knife that couldn't cut through dragon hide but might discourage smaller threats. A water container that you guard more carefully than most people once guarded their jewelry. A small bundle of food that represents the difference between existing and not existing for another day. Rising from this bed is a deliberate process. No sudden movements, no unnecessary noise. You listen first, extending your senses as far as possible into the world beyond your walls. The morning sounds tell you whether the night has left any new dangers nearby. The absence of certain sounds tells you whether the local population of smaller creatures has been reduced by something passing through. Your body moves stiffly, joints protesting the night spent on stone and hide. But this stiffness is preferable to the alternative. You've seen what happens to people who build soft beds, who prioritize comfort over survival. Their remains are usually found still wrapped in their blankets, having slept too deeply to hear the danger approaching. The light that filters into your shelter is never quite the right color. Sometimes it's orange with fire, sometimes gray with ash, sometimes that peculiar greenish tint that means something toxic is burning nearby. You've learned to read the quality of light like a weather report, to understand what the color of the morning tells you about what kind of day you're about to have. As you prepare to face another day in this world, you perform the same mental calculation that every human here performs upon waking. Not, what do I want to do today? But what do I need to do to still be alive when the sun sets? It's a simpler question in some ways, but infinitely more complex in its implications. The dust settles back onto your ceiling. The vibrations fade from the ground. The roar becomes a memory that will join all the other roars in the catalog of sounds that your mind has learned to process and file away. Another morning has begun in the world where dragons rule the sky, and you are still alive to experience it. For now. At least you don't have to worry about your morning commute, though will I be incinerated on the way to get water does make traffic jams seem quaint. For now means you have work to do. The simple act of washing your face becomes a negotiation with scarcity and danger. The first in a series of small battles that will define whether for now extends through another day. Water is not something that flows freely from a tap when you turn a handle. Every drop you possess has been carried, filtered, and rationed with the precision of a military operation. The container beside your bed holds perhaps 2 cups of water, enough for a careful face washing. A few sips to wet your mouth, and little else. You learned long ago that the sound of running water carries farther than you might expect. Rivers and streams that once provided easy access to fresh water now serve as gathering places for creatures that have learned to associate the sound of flowing liquid with the presence of prey. Open water attracts scavengers, and scavengers attract larger predators, and larger predators attract the attention of things that rule the sky. The water in your container is not clear. It's been strained through cloth to remove the larger particles of ash and debris, but it still carries the faint gray tint that all water has now. You've become skilled at letting sediment settle overnight, at pouring carefully to avoid disturbing the layer of particulates that collects at the bottom. The taste is metallic, slightly bitter, with an aftertaste that reminds you of smoke and distant fire. You pour a small amount into your cupped palm and press it against your face. The water is cold, having absorbed the chill of the stone walls during the night. It feels sharp against your skin, cutting through the film of ash and sweat that accumulates simply from breathing the air in this world. You work it around your eyes, clearing away the dust that settles there while you sleep, trying to remove the grit that makes your eyelids feel like sandpaper. Bathing is a luxury that belongs to a different life. The kind of full-body washing that you once took for granted now requires resources you cannot spare and exposes you to risks you cannot afford. Soap is something that exists in memory and rumor, occasionally traded between settlements at prices that would once have seemed absurd. Most people make do with rough cloth and careful rationing of water, cleaning one part of their body at a time over the course of several days. The 5-star hotel experience now consists of having enough water to wash both your face and your hands on the same day. Your reflection, glimpsed in the dark surface of the water, looks older than your years. The face that stares back at you has been weathered by constant exposure to ash and smoke, aged by the stress of living in a state of perpetual alertness. The skin around your eyes is creased with lines that come from squinting against the harsh light of fires and the constant need to scan the horizon for threats. Your hair, when you can see it clearly, has taken on the uniform gray tint that all organic matter acquires in this world. No one thrives here. Survival is not about flourishing or growing or becoming a better version of yourself. It's about enduring, about maintaining the basic functions of life for one more day. Your body has adapted to this reality by becoming efficient in ways that would have alarmed you in your previous life. You need less food to function, though you rarely have enough. You need less water, though every drop is precious. You need less sleep, though the sleep you do get is restless and interrupted. The process of washing reveals the small injuries that you've learned to live with. Tiny cuts from handling rough stone and salvaged materials, burns from getting too close to heat sources, scrapes from moving through spaces that were not designed for human habitation. Your hands, especially, tell the story of your adaptation to this world. The palms are calloused from handling tools and materials that would have torn softer skin. The fingernails are permanently stained with ash and worn down from constant use. You run the damp cloth over your arms and chest, cleaning away the layer of grime that accumulates simply from existing in this environment. The skin underneath is pale, almost translucent, from the lack of clean sunlight. Most of the light that reaches you has been filtered through smoke and ash, giving it a quality that seems to leach color from everything it touches. Your body has learned to function with less vitamin D, less direct sunlight, less of all the things that once seemed essential to human health. The air in your shelter already carries the smell of ash, even this early in the morning. It's a smell that penetrates everything, that becomes part of the background of existence until you notice it only when it's occasionally absent. The ash is not just the residue of fires. It's the pulverized remains of everything that couldn't survive the casual destruction that follows in the wake of creatures who reshape the landscape by simply existing in it. Your lungs have adapted to processing this air, developing a tolerance for particulates that would have sent you into coughing fits in your previous life. But the adaptation comes at a cost. Your breathing is shallower, more careful, designed to minimize the amount of contaminated air you take in. You've learned to breathe through your nose when possible, to use your mouth only when necessary, to cover your face with cloth when the air is particularly thick with debris. The morning routine continues with the careful conservation of resources. The water you've used for washing is not discarded, but allowed to settle so that it can be reused for other purposes. Nothing is wasted in this world, because waste is a luxury that belongs to a time when resources were abundant and easily replaced. Every drop of water, every scrap of food, every piece of material that can be repurposed or reused represents the difference between existing and not existing for one more day. Your body moves through these motions with the efficiency of long practice, but underneath the routine is the constant awareness that this is not normal. This is not how humans are supposed to live. The part of your mind that remembers a different world recognizes the degradation, the compromise, the steady erosion of everything that once made life worth living rather than simply endurable. But that part of your mind is a luxury you cannot afford to indulge. Nostalgia for a better world serves no purpose when your immediate concern is surviving the world that actually exists. The morning washing is complete, your face is clean enough to function, and your body is prepared for another day of calculating risks and making the small decisions that will determine whether you see another sunset. The smell of ash grows stronger as the day progresses, reminding you that somewhere in the distance something is burning. It might be a natural fire, or it might be the result of something much larger expressing its dominance over the landscape. Either way, it's a reminder that you live in a world where destruction is constant, and your survival depends on your ability to stay small, stay quiet, and stay invisible to the forces that could end your existence without even noticing you were there. Staying invisible requires fuel, and your stomach announces its needs with a hollow ache that you've learned to interpret as a schedule rather than a sensation. Hunger here is not the pleasant anticipation of a favorite meal or the mild discomfort of skipping lunch. It's a constant, gnawing reminder that your body is consuming itself to stay alive, breaking down muscle and fat reserves that you can't afford to lose but have no choice but to sacrifice. The food storage in your shelter consists of a collection of containers salvaged from various sources, each one carefully sealed against the intrusion of moisture, ash, and the small creatures that have learned to associate human habitation with the possibility of sustenance. These containers hold your survival in measured portions, hard root vegetables that have been dried and stored, strips of meat that have been cured with salt and smoke, and bread that has been baked hard enough to resist spoilage for weeks at a time. You learned long ago not to ask what died to provide the meat in your stores. The answer is rarely comforting, and the knowledge serves no practical purpose. What matters is that the flesh has been properly preserved, that it shows no signs of the rot or contamination that can kill you just as surely as a dragon's breath. The meat is tough, requiring careful chewing to break down the fibers, and it carries the smoky taste of the fires used to cure it. At times there's an underlying flavor that speaks to a diet of things that don't grow in clean soil. But protein is protein, and your body has learned to extract what it needs from whatever sources are available. The root vegetables are local varieties that have proven capable of growing in soil that's been contaminated by ash and the chemical byproducts of dragon presence. They're not the sweet, tender vegetables you might remember from a different life, but dense, fibrous tubers that can survive in conditions that would kill more delicate plants. They taste of earth and smoke, with a bitter undertone that comes from absorbing minerals that didn't exist in the soil before the world changed. You've learned to appreciate their solid weight in your stomach, the way they provide sustained energy without the quick highs and crashes of foods that contain more sugar. The bread is perhaps the most precious item in your food stores, not because it tastes particularly good, it doesn't, but because it represents the complex cooperation required to grow grain, mill it into flour, and bake it into something that can sustain human life. Each loaf is the product of fields that had to be protected during the growing season, grain that had to be harvested despite the constant threat of aerial destruction, and ovens that had to be fired despite the risk that the smoke would attract unwanted attention. People used to farm in the traditional sense, with neat rows of crops extending across acres of cleared land, with barns and silos and the infrastructure of agricultural abundance. Those days exist now only in memory and in the ruins that dot the landscape, like tombstones marking the death of a more optimistic time. The farms that survive now are small, hidden affairs, tucked into valleys or built into hillsides where they're less visible from above. The crops are planted in patterns that don't create obvious geometric shapes when viewed from the air, scattered and camouflaged to look like natural growth rather than deliberate cultivation. The farmers who tend these hidden gardens move like ghosts through their own fields, working in the early morning hours when the air is cooler and the visibility is reduced by mist and smoke. They plant by moonlight, harvest in silence, and transport their crops along routes that avoid open ground and exposed roads. Many of them sleep in their fields, not in farmhouses that would announce their presence to anything passing overhead, but in shelters that are indistinguishable from the natural features of the landscape. The trading that brings food to your shelter happens in whispers and careful exchanges, usually at night or in the deep shadows of ruins where the walls provide some protection from observation. Currency has evolved beyond coins and paper, money to include anything that has practical value in this new world, metal that can be shaped into tools, cloth that can be used for clothing or shelter, medicines that can treat the injuries and illnesses that are common in a world where professional medical care is a luxury few can afford. You prepare your morning meal with the same careful attention to resource conservation that governs every aspect of your existence. The portion of meat you allow yourself is small, perhaps the size of your thumb, enough to provide some protein but not so much that you'll exhaust your stores before you can replenish them. The root vegetables are sliced thin and eaten slowly, each bite chewed thoroughly to extract maximum nutrition and to make the small portion last as long as possible. The bread is hard enough to require soaking in water before you can bite through it, but the water used for this purpose is not wasted. It absorbs some of the bread's substance, becoming a thin gruel that provides additional nutrition and helps to make you feel fuller than the actual quantity of food would suggest. This gruel tastes of flour and ash, with the faint metallic tang that all water carries now, but it fills your stomach and provides the carbohydrates that your body needs to function. Dragons don't hunt for food in the way that conventional predators do. They don't stalk prey or plan attacks based on hunger. Their relationship with the landscape is more fundamental than that, more akin to the way that weather patterns reshape the earth through their mere existence. They burn forests not because they need to clear the land, but because fire is part of their nature, as natural and unconscious as breathing. They freeze rivers not out of malice, but because their bodies radiate cold the way the sun radiates heat. This means that the destruction they cause is not motivated by hunger or anger or any emotion that you could understand or predict. It's simply the result of their presence, the inevitable consequence of creatures whose very existence alters the environment around them. A dragon that breathes fire doesn't choose to burn your crops. It simply breathes, and the fire that is part of its nature transforms everything within its reach. You're just in the way. Not a target, not an enemy, not even a particular concern. You're simply one of many small, fragile things that happen to exist in the same space as creatures whose casual movements can reshape the landscape. Your crops burn because they're made of combustible material and they're in the path of creatures that produce fire. Your livestock die because they're made of flesh and bone and they're in the presence of creatures that can kill without effort or intention. The meal you're eating represents the survival of food sources that manage to avoid this casual destruction, either through luck, careful concealment, or the simple fact that they were growing in places where dragons had no reason to go. Each bite is a small victory against the constant pressure of a world that seems designed to make human survival as difficult as possible, without actually targeting humans specifically. Looking down at your meal, Gordon Ramsay would have some thoughts about the presentation, though still technically edible, has become the new Michelin standard. As you eat, you listen to the sounds of the morning world awakening around you. The distant call of birds that have learned to nest in places that are too small or too hidden to attract larger predators. The rustle of small creatures moving through the debris that litters the ground everywhere now. The occasional distant sound that might be wind moving through ruins, or might be something much larger breathing in its sleep. Your body processes the food with the efficiency of an organism that has learned to extract maximum nutrition from minimal resources. Every calorie is precious, every vitamin and mineral a small contribution to the complex process of staying alive in a world that offers no guarantees about tomorrow. The food settles in your stomach like a promise that you'll have the energy to face whatever challenges the day might bring, even though you know that energy alone won't be enough to protect you from the larger forces that shape this world. The taste lingers in your mouth long after the meal is finished, a reminder of the complex chain of survival that brought this food to your shelter, and a promise that you'll need to find more before your stores run out. That promise weighs on you as the aftertaste of your meal fades and you turn your attention to the pile of garments that represents your armor against the world. These are not clothes in the sense you once understood them, pieces of fabric chosen for comfort, style, or the simple pleasure of wearing something that felt good against your skin. These are survival tools, each layer carefully selected based on its ability to keep you alive for one more day. Your garments are an archaeology of adaptation, built up over months of trial and error, of learning what works and what gets you killed. The base layer is a shirt woven from wool that has been treated with ash and smoke until it no longer holds the clean scent of the sheep it came from. The wool is coarse, scratchy against your skin, but it retains warmth even when damp and doesn't catch fire as easily as the softer fabrics you once preferred. The shirt is patched in several places with squares of different material, leather where the original wool wore through, strips of hide where sharp edges tore holes that needed reinforcing. Over this goes a vest made from overlapping scales that you've collected from various sources over the past months. Not dragon scales, those are impossibly rare and valuable beyond anything you could ever afford. These are smaller scales, salvaged from creatures that died in the wake of larger predators, creatures that learned to grow armor but weren't quite tough enough to survive contact with the apex predators of this world. The scales are sewn onto a backing of thick cloth with thread that you've made from plant fibers, creating a flexible layer of protection that might stop a claw or deflect a piece of falling debris. Each scale tells a story of scavenging and survival. Some are dark brown, almost black, with the dull sheen of creatures that lived in caves and shadows. Others are lighter, with patterns that suggest they once belonged to animals that moved through environments where camouflage was essential. A few are scarred or cracked, bearing the marks of whatever killed their original owners, but still functional enough to provide some protection for their new purpose. The scales don't fit together perfectly. You're not a trained armorer, and the materials you work with are whatever you can find rather than what would be ideal for the job. The gaps between scales are filled with patches of leather and cloth, creating a patchwork appearance that speaks to the improvised nature of your protection. But the vest serves its purpose. It saved your life twice when falling debris struck your chest, and once when a panicked scavenger animal tried to claw its way through you to escape something larger. Your outer layer is a coat made from hide that has been treated with smoke and oils until it's as waterproof as you can make it. The hide came from a large animal that died during one of the winter freezes, when dragons that breathe cold moved through the area and left a trail of frozen corpses behind them. The coat is too big for you. Originally intended for someone with broader shoulders and a larger frame, but loose clothing provides better protection than fitted garments, and the extra space allows for additional layers when the weather turns harsh. The coat is stained with the evidence of your survival. Dark patches where blood soaked through the hide during injuries you survived. Light streaks where acid rain ran off the treated surface. Burn marks around the edges where you got too close to fires that were necessary despite their danger. The coat smells like old fear and smoke, like the countless times you've worn it while running from threats or hiding in places where cleanliness was less important than invisibility. Your pants are made from layered cloth and hide, reinforced at the knees and seat with patches of the toughest material you could find. The knees are particularly important. You spend a lot of time crawling through spaces that weren't designed for human passage, moving through ruins and debris fields where standing upright would make you visible to things that are best avoided. The reinforcement has saved your skin countless times, though the underlying fabric is wearing thin in places where even the patches couldn't prevent the constant friction from taking its toll. Your boots are perhaps the most important part of your outfit and the most difficult to maintain. They're made from thick leather that has been treated with oils and wrapped with strips of hide to provide additional protection. The soles are reinforced with metal plates salvaged from various sources, creating a barrier between your feet and the sharp debris that covers most surfaces in this world. The boots are designed to be silent when you walk, with soft soles that don't click against stone or crunch through ash in ways that might announce your presence. But boots wear out quickly when you're walking across landscapes that are littered with sharp metal, broken stone, and the acidic residue of dragon presence. The leather cracks despite your best efforts to maintain it. The metal plates work loose and need to be resecured with whatever materials you can find. The boots are currently on their third set of soles, each replacement a little thinner than the last, as your supply of suitable materials dwindles. Armor, in the traditional sense, is beyond your means. The kind of metal protection that might actually stop a dragon's claw or deflect. A burst of flame costs more than you could earn in years of whatever work is available to someone like you. The people who can afford real armor are the ones who have made deals with dragons, who have found ways to profit from the New World Order rather than simply surviving it. For everyone else, protection comes from layers of improvised materials and the hope that being small and unnoticed is better than being well protected and visible. Everything you wear smells like old fear. It's not just the smoke and ash that permeate all materials in this world. It's the scent of human terror, absorbed into the fabric during the countless moments when you've worn these clothes, while genuinely believing you were about to die. The smell is faint but persistent. A reminder that these garments have been with you through every close call, every desperate escape, every night spent hiding in places where the walls were thin and the shadows were full of sounds that might have been wind or might have been something hunting. Every piece of clothing you put on represents a calculation about mobility versus protection, warmth versus silence, visibility versus camouflage. The bright colors that you once wore to express personality or mood are now dangerous luxuries that could attract attention from miles away. Everything is dyed in shades of gray and brown, colors that blend with ash and smoke, that make you harder to spot against the backgrounds of ruin and debris that define your world. Fashion Week would be a much shorter event. The entire collection could be summarized as 50 Shades of Please Don't Notice Me. You dress with the methodical precision of someone who has learned that every choice matters. Each button is fastened with care, because a loose garment can catch on debris when you need to move quickly. Each layer is arranged to provide maximum protection while maintaining your ability to run, to hide, to fit through spaces that might offer temporary safety. The process takes longer than it once did, But speed is less important than thoroughness when your life depends on the details. The ritual of dressing becomes a form of meditation, a way of preparing your mind for the day ahead. As you pull on each layer, you remind yourself of the lessons that each piece of clothing represents. The patches teach you about adaptation and making do with what you have. The stains remind you of dangers survived and mistakes that didn't prove fatal. The weight of the layers on your shoulders is a constant reminder that you're carrying the tools of your survival, that every piece of fabric and hide and salvage scale is part of the complex system that keeps you alive. When you're finally dressed, you perform one last check, running your hands over each layer to ensure that everything is properly secured, that nothing is loose or damaged in ways that might compromise your safety. Your reflection, glimpsed in the dark surface of your water container, shows a figure that looks more like a refugee from some long-forgotten war than the person you once were. But this is who you are now, and this is what survival looks like in a world where dragons rule the sky and humans learn to live in the spaces between their attention. The clothes make you ready for whatever the day might bring, but they also make you ready for the day to end. Every morning you dress with the possibility that these might be the last clothes you ever wear, that the protection they provide might not be enough for whatever challenges lie ahead. But they're the best you can do with the resources you have. And in a world where the best you can do is rarely enough, that has to be sufficient. You step toward the door of your shelter, your body properly armored against the world, your mind prepared for another day of small victories and careful compromises. The taste of your morning meal has faded completely now, replaced by the familiar sensation of being ready to face whatever lies beyond the safety of your walls. What lies beyond those walls is work, the kind of work that keeps you alive but has no grand title, no career path, no advancement opportunities that lead to corner offices or retirement plans. You are what the surviving communities call a minor human, someone whose job is to handle the small, necessary tasks that keep civilization limping along in the spaces between dragon attention. It's not what the career counselor recommended, but professional debris mover does have better job security than most positions that existed before the sky became hostile. You clear debris from paths that need to stay passable. You rebuild sections of road that have been damaged by the casual passage of creatures whose footsteps can crack stone. You deliver messages between settlements when the information is too sensitive to trust to signals that might be observed from above. Your employer, if you can call them that, is whoever has something that needs doing and something to offer in exchange. There is no central authority coordinating the work, no government agency assigning tasks based on efficiency or need. The economy of survival operates on a much simpler principle. If you can do something that helps someone else stay alive, they might be willing to help you stay alive in return. The currency is necessity, and the market is regulated by the simple fact that dead people can't honor their agreements. This morning's assignment takes you to the eastern approach to your settlement, where the main road has been blocked by debris from a recent restructuring event. The polite term for what happens when something very large decides to rearrange the landscape. The road is one of the few remaining connections between your community and the trading posts that provide access to supplies that can't be produced locally. Without it, the settlement becomes isolated, cut off from the networks of exchange that make survival possible in this reduced world. You gather your tools before leaving your shelter, a shovel with a handle that's been repaired 3 times, a pry bar salvaged from some previous construction project, and a small sledgehammer that's useful for breaking apart chunks of masonry that are too large to move intact. The tools are worn smooth by constant use, their metal surfaces pitted with rust and corrosion from exposure to the acidic ash that settles on everything. But they're functional, and functionality is the only quality that matters in tools that might mean the difference between completing a job and being trapped in the open when something dangerous notices your presence. The walk to the work site requires constant vigilance. You follow a route that has been mapped out over months of careful observation, a path that avoids the areas where dragons are known to rest, hunt, or establish territory. The route is not the shortest distance between 2 points. Efficiency has become a luxury that few people can afford. Instead, it's a carefully planned journey that prioritizes concealment and escape options over speed or convenience. You move through the ruins of what was once a residential neighborhood, where houses that were built to last for generations were reduced to rubble in a matter of minutes. The destruction here wasn't targeted or deliberate. It was simply the result of something very large, moving through the area without regard for the smaller structures that happened to be in its path. The walls that remain standing are scorched and cracked, their surfaces bearing the distinctive patterns that mark dragon passage. Long furrows where claws dragged across stone, circular areas where intense heat melted everything within a specific radius, patches of discoloration where chemical reactions have changed the very composition of the building materials. The debris field you're assigned to clear stretches across the road for nearly 100 yards. A mixture of broken stone, twisted metal, and chunks of masonry that have been fused together by extreme heat. Some pieces are small enough to be lifted by hand, but others weigh hundreds of pounds and require careful leverage and planning to move. The work is physically demanding, but it's also mentally exhausting because every decision about where to place a piece of debris, how to arrange the tools, where to position yourself for maximum efficiency, must be made with the constant awareness that you might need to abandon everything and run at any moment. You begin with the smaller pieces, clearing a path through the debris that's wide enough for a single person to pass through. This is not about restoring the road to its original condition. That would require equipment and materials that no longer exist. It's about creating a passage that allows people to move between settlements without having to expose themselves to the dangers of traveling through completely open country. The path you're clearing will be narrow, winding, and partially concealed by the larger pieces of debris that you're leaving in place, but it will be passable for people who know where to look for it. Every trip is a risk, whether you're traveling to a work site or carrying messages between communities. The roads that were once busy highways connecting thriving cities are now dangerous corridors that people use only when they absolutely must. Some roads have been abandoned entirely, either because they pass through areas that have become too dangerous or because the destinations they once served no longer exist. The remaining routes are maintained by people like you, working in small groups or alone, keeping the connections alive through countless hours of dangerous, unglamorous labor. There are watchers on the hills around your settlement, people whose job is to scan the sky and the surrounding countryside for signs of approaching danger. They're positioned at points that provide good visibility while offering some protection from aerial observation, usually in ruins or natural formations that can provide cover if something takes an interest in their activities. The watchers use a system of signals that has been developed over months of trial and error, colored cloth strips that can be displayed quickly and taken down just as fast, arrangements of stones that convey specific meanings to people who know how to read them, and occasionally, when the message is urgent enough to justify the risk, brief, light signals that can be seen from miles away. If the watchers signal red, you run. No questions, no hesitation, no attempt to save the work you've already completed. Red means that something is approaching that could kill you, and the only appropriate response is to get to cover as quickly as possible. You've learned to work with one eye on the watchers, and your feet positioned so that you can drop your tools and sprint toward the nearest shelter without having to think about which direction to go. The tools can be replaced eventually, but you cannot. Most deaths happen during normal work, not during the dramatic encounters that people imagine when they think about living in a world full of dragons. The creatures that rule the sky are not constantly hunting humans. They're too large and too powerful to be particularly interested in prey that provides so little sustenance. Most human deaths occur during the routine activities that are necessary for survival: clearing debris, repairing structures, traveling between settlements, or simply being in the wrong place when something decides to express its dominance over the landscape. The work is monotonous in the way that all physical labor becomes monotonous, but it's also unpredictable in ways that keep you constantly alert. You never know when you'll uncover something dangerous beneath the debris: a pocket of toxic gas, a sharp piece of metal that could cause a serious injury, or the remains of someone who wasn't fast enough to get out of the way when the destruction occurred. You've learned to work methodically, testing each piece of debris before committing to moving it, paying attention to the sounds and smells that might indicate hidden hazards. The physical demands of the work have changed your body in ways that would have alarmed you in your previous life. Your muscles have adapted to the constant lifting and carrying, but they've also become lean and efficient rather than strong in the way that might come from regular exercise in a gym. Your hands are permanently stained with ash and scarred from countless small cuts and abrasions. Your back aches constantly from the bending and lifting, but you've learned to work through the pain because there's no alternative that allows you to continue, earning the resources you need to survive. Fire doesn't care about your errands. This is perhaps the most important lesson you've learned about working in this world. Dragons don't distinguish between people who are engaged in essential work and people who are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The flames that can melt stone don't become less hot because you're performing a task that benefits your community. The claws that can tear through metal don't become less sharp because you're trying to make a living in whatever way is available to you. Your work schedule is determined not by clocks or calendars, but by conditions that change from day to day based on factors that are completely outside your control. Some days the air is clear enough and the watchers are confident enough to allow for extended work periods. Other days you might travel to your assigned site only to discover that the risk level has increased overnight, forcing you to return to your shelter without accomplishing anything. The unpredictability is frustrating, but it's also part of the adaptation that has allowed you to survive when others have not. The compensation for your work comes in the form of goods and services rather than money. Currency, in the traditional sense, has become largely meaningless in a world where the value of any object depends on its immediate utility for survival. Instead, you're paid in food, water, materials for maintaining your shelter, or access to services like medical care or equipment repair. The economy operates on a complex system of barter and mutual obligation that requires you to maintain relationships with multiple people and communities, spreading your risk across several sources of support. When you finish clearing a section of road, you don't receive a paycheck or a performance review. You get the satisfaction of knowing that you've contributed to the survival of your community, and the promise that when you need something in return, the people who benefited from your work will remember their obligation to help you. It's a fragile system based on trust and mutual dependence, but it's the only system that works in a world where centralized authority has become impossible to maintain. The work continues as long as there's light to work by and no immediate threats in the area. You pace yourself carefully because exhaustion makes you careless, and carelessness can be fatal when you're working with heavy objects in an environment where you might need to run for your life at any moment. The debris pile slowly shrinks as you move piece after piece to the sides of the road, creating a narrow passage that will allow people to travel between settlements without exposing themselves to the dangers of open country. As the day progresses, you become increasingly aware of the small signs that tell you about the larger world beyond your immediate work area. The quality of the light changes as smoke drifts across the sky from fires that might be miles away. The air carries sounds that might be wind through ruins or might be something much larger moving in the distance. Your body learns to process these signals without conscious thought, filing them away as part of the constant background assessment that keeps you alive while allowing you to focus on the immediate task at hand. The work is never truly finished. Even after you've cleared a path through the debris, the road will continue to deteriorate from exposure to the elements and the occasional passage of creatures that don't recognize human construction as something to be avoided. In a few weeks or months, you'll likely be back here, clearing new debris and repairing damage that's accumulated since your last visit. But that's the nature of survival in this world. It's not about solving problems permanently, but about managing them well enough to continue existing from one day to the next. When the light begins to fade and the watchers signal that it's time to return to the settlement, you gather your tools and prepare for the journey back to your shelter. The work you've accomplished today is small in the grand scheme of the world's problems, but it's significant in the context of your immediate survival and the survival of the people who depend on the connections you help maintain. Tomorrow there will be other debris to clear, other roads to repair, other small tasks that keep the fragile network of human civilization functioning in the spaces between dragon attention. You are a minor human, and your job is to do the small things that make survival possible for everyone else. And everyone else includes the dragons, though they would never acknowledge your efforts or understand the concept of gratitude for the roads you clear or the messages you carry. The first thing you need to understand about dragons is that they don't sparkle. There are no jewel-tone scales that catch the light like stained glass windows. No graceful serpentine necks that move with the fluid beauty of dancers. The creatures that rule your world are built for function, not aesthetics, and their function is to dominate every environment they encounter through the simple application of overwhelming physical power. They don't speak, at least not in any way that human ears can interpret as language. There are no ancient conversations about the nature of wisdom or the burden of immortality. Customer service has definitely declined since they took over management of the planet. No riddles posed to test the worthiness of heroes, no bargains struck in exchange for knowledge or power. The sounds they make are purely functional, territorial calls that can be heard for miles, warning roars that announce their presence to anything that might be foolish enough to challenge them, and the deep, resonant breathing that sounds like wind moving through caverns larger than any structure humans have ever built. The dragons you share this world with barely notice you, not because they're choosing to ignore you out of some kind of benevolent indifference, but because the difference in scale between your existence and theirs makes you functionally invisible most of the time. You are to them what insects are to you, occasionally annoying, sometimes interesting enough to observe briefly, but generally not worth the effort required to pay attention to your individual activities. Their wings are not the delicate, bat-like membranes of fantasy illustrations. These are massive structures built to support creatures that weigh several tons, stretched between bones that are thicker than tree trunks and reinforced with cartilage that has been hardened by centuries of use. When a dragon spreads its wings, the sound is not the gentle whisper of silk through air, but a deep, percussive thunderclap that can be felt in your chest from miles away. The wings themselves display so much air that their passage creates wind patterns that can knock a full-grown human off their feet. The wing beats are louder than thunder, but not in the sharp, crackling way that lightning produces sound. This is a deeper, more sustained noise that seems to come from the earth itself, a rhythmic pounding that synchronizes with your heartbeat and makes your bones vibrate in sympathy. The sound carries for extraordinary distances, bouncing off mountains and rolling across valleys like the footsteps of giants walking across the sky. When you hear wing beats, you stop whatever you're doing and listen, because the direction and intensity of the sound tells you whether you need to find cover immediately or whether you have a few minutes to finish whatever task might be keeping you alive. Their eyes are older than cities, older than the written records that once documented human civilization, older than the oldest stories that your grandparents might have told about the world before dragons returned to reclaim it. The eyes are not the bright, intelligent orbs of creatures that think in ways humans can understand, but something far more alien and far more unsettling. They have the patient, implacable quality of geological processes, the same indifference that mountains show to the weather that shapes them over millennia. When a dragon looks at you, and you'll know when it happens because the sensation is unmistakable, it's not examining you as an individual. It's processing you as a piece of environmental data, categorizing you the same way it might categorize a rock formation or a cloud pattern. The gaze is neither hostile nor friendly, but it carries a weight that makes your body respond with the same instinctive terror that your ancestors felt when they realized they were being watched by something that could kill them without effort or malice. Some dragons breathe fire, but not the controlled, directed flames of movie special effects. This is fire that behaves like a liquid, pouring from their mouths in torrents that can melt steel from 100 yards away. The flames are not orange or red, but white-hot at their core, fading to blue and then to the deep smoky red that marks the edges of destruction. The heat arrives before the fire itself, a wave of superheated air that can kill you through your lungs and cook your internal organs, before the flames ever touch your skin. The fire doesn't burn out quickly like a normal flame. It clings to whatever it touches, spreading and intensifying until it has consumed everything combustible in its path. Stone doesn't burn, but it can melt, flowing like thick honey as the dragon fire transforms solid rock into molten rivers that will take hours to cool and solidify. Metal doesn't just heat up, it becomes liquid, then vapor, then disappears entirely as the molecular bonds that hold it together are overwhelmed by the sheer energy being applied to them. Other dragons exhale cold that is so absolute it can freeze the moisture in your lungs before you can scream. This is not the gentle cold of winter air, but something that operates on a completely different principle. A cold that seems to drain the heat from everything it touches rather than simply providing a contrast to warmth. The air around these dragons shimmers with ice crystals that form and shatter constantly, creating a sound like wind chimes made of glass breaking in slow motion. The cold spreads outward from the dragon's breath in patterns that follow no rules you can predict or understand. Sometimes it moves like fog, flowing along the ground and pooling in low areas. Other times it seems to seek out specific targets, flowing uphill or changing direction to follow the warmth signatures of living creatures. When the cold touches you, it doesn't feel like normal cold. It feels like the absence of heat, like the concept of warmth is being drained from your body faster than your metabolism can replace it. There are dragons that spit acid capable of dissolving stone, creating pits in the landscape that fill with toxic pools that never seem to evaporate or neutralize. The acid is not the simple chemical you might remember from science class, but something that seems to actively seek out the molecular bonds that hold matter together. It eats through metal, stone, and organic matter with equal efficiency, leaving behind smooth-walled cavities that look like they were carved by some impossibly precise tool. The acid doesn't just destroy, it transforms. Materials that it touches don't simply dissolve but change into other substances entirely, creating new compounds that have properties unlike anything that existed before. The pools that form where acid has collected are not just dangerous because they're caustic, but because they're fundamentally alien, filled with materials that don't behave according to the chemistry that once governed your world. Some dragons possess abilities that are even more difficult to categorize or understand. There are dragons whose very presence seems to drain the energy from living things, not through any visible attack, but through some quality that makes plants wither and animals grow weak and listless. Others emit sounds that can shatter glass, collapse buildings, or simply make it impossible for humans to think clearly while they're in the area. A few dragons seem to affect the electromagnetic fields around them, causing metal objects to become impossibly heavy or impossibly light, making compasses spin wildly, and creating areas where electronic devices, when they can be found and maintained, simply stop working. These effects don't follow any pattern that human science can explain, but they're consistent enough that people have learned to recognize the signs and avoid the areas where such dragons are active. No one knows where dragons come from. They appeared in your world without warning, without any of the gradual signs that might have allowed humans to prepare for their arrival. One day the sky was empty except for birds and aircraft. The next day it belonged to creatures that made both birds and aircraft seem like toys by comparison. There were no eggs found, no nests discovered, no young dragons that might have provided clues about their life cycle or reproductive habits. Some people believe that dragons are ancient creatures that have always existed, sleeping deep beneath the earth or in hidden dimensions that occasionally intersect with your reality. These theories suggest that dragons are part of the natural order, apex predators that have returned to reclaim a world that was always rightfully theirs. The evidence for this theory is the age that seems to radiate from their eyes, the sense that they have seen civilizations rise and fall, that they remember times when humans were nothing more than clever animals scurrying around the edges of a world that belonged to larger, more powerful beings. Others believe that dragons are a form of punishment, either divine retribution for human arrogance or the inevitable consequence of a species that grew too confident in its dominance over the natural world. These theories point to the timing of the dragon's arrival, which coincided with humanity's peak technological development, as evidence that the dragons are a corrective force designed to humble a species that had forgotten its place in the larger order of things. The truth is that no one knows, and the dragons themselves offer no clues about their origins or their intentions. They simply exist, reshaping the world through their presence, indifferent to human theories about their nature or purpose. They are forces of nature in the most literal sense, phenomena that occur because the conditions for their existence have been met, regardless of what any other species might think about their appropriateness or timing. Each dragon is unique, not just in its physical characteristics, but in its behavior and the specific ways it interacts with the environment. Some seem to prefer mountainous regions, making their homes in caves or on peaks that provide commanding views of the surrounding territory. Others are drawn to water, taking up residence in lakes or rivers that they transform through their presence into something that no longer resembles the bodies of water that existed before their arrival. The dragons don't seem to compete with each other for territory or resources. There are no dragon wars, no battles for dominance that humans can observe or understand. Instead, they seem to operate according to some system of mutual avoidance or coexistence that allows multiple dragons to inhabit the same general area without direct conflict. This might be because they require different types of resources, or because their individual territories are large enough that overlap is minimal, or because they're operating according to rules that are simply beyond human comprehension. What you do know is that dragons are not temporary visitors to your world. They have taken up residence with the permanence of geological features, reshaping the landscape and the climate to suit their needs without regard for the previous inhabitants. They are not conquerors in the political sense, because conquest implies a kind of organized intention that doesn't seem to motivate their behavior. They are simply the new reality, the dominant force that defines the conditions under which all other life must now exist. The dragons sleep, but not in the way that humans sleep. Their rest periods are irregular and unpredictable, lasting anywhere from hours to days, and they don't seem to require the kind of deep, restorative sleep that leaves other creatures vulnerable. Even when they appear to be sleeping, they remain partially aware of their surroundings, capable of responding to threats or disturbances with a speed that suggests they're never truly unconscious. When dragons move, they don't travel in straight lines or follow routes that make sense from a human perspective. They move according to patterns that might be related to air currents, magnetic fields, or factors that humans can't detect or understand. Their movements reshape the landscape not through deliberate destruction, but through the simple fact that the ground isn't designed to support creatures of their size and weight moving at the speeds they can achieve. This is what dragons are like: ancient, powerful, indifferent, and absolutely unconcerned with your continued existence. They are the new rulers of your world, not because they conquered it, but because they simply arrived and began living in it as if it had always belonged to them. And in a world where dragons exist, perhaps it always did. These new rulers require subjects who understand their place. The societies that have survived are not the ones that tried to fight back or establish dominance over their territories. They are the ones that learned to build their entire civilization around the fundamental truth that they are no longer the apex species on their own planet. Your settlement is not a city in any sense that would have been recognizable in the time before dragons. It's a collection of low, interconnected structures that have been designed to look like natural rock formations when viewed from above. The buildings are arranged in patterns that avoid the geometric regularity that might catch the attention of something surveying the landscape from several thousand feet up. Streets curve and branch in ways that follow the natural contours of the land rather than the efficient grid patterns that once characterized urban planning. The walls that surround your community are not built to keep invaders out. No wall that humans could construct would slow down a creature that can melt stone with its breath. Instead, the walls are designed to diffuse heat, to provide some protection against the environmental effects of dragon presence, and to create acoustic barriers that might muffle the sounds of human activity that could attract unwanted attention. The walls are thick, built from multiple layers of different materials, each layer serving a specific function in the complex task of making human habitations slightly less obvious and slightly more survivable. Every settlement that has lasted more than a few months has learned to establish a relationship with at least one dragon. Not a partnership or an alliance. Those terms imply a level of mutual respect and communication that simply doesn't exist. What develops instead is a form of tribute system based on careful observation of what seems to satisfy or at least appease the creature that has claimed dominance over the area. The tribute is not negotiated or agreed upon, but discovered through trial and error, through the careful study of which offerings result in periods of relative peace and which ones seem to provoke increased attention. It's like having the world's most dangerous homeowners association, except the bylaws are written in fire and the penalties are non-negotiable. The tribute varies depending on the dragon and the resources available to the community. Some dragons seem to prefer livestock, not because they're particularly hungry, but because the presence of large animals in their territory appears to satisfy some territorial instinct that humans can observe but not understand. These communities maintain herds of cattle or sheep that they release at regular intervals, watching from a safe distance as the animals wander into areas where they're likely to be noticed by the local dragon. Other dragons are attracted to shiny objects, leading to communities that specialize in metalworking and jewelry production, creating elaborate displays of polished metal and precious stones that they arrange in patterns that can be seen from the air. The artisans who create these tributes work with materials that have been salvaged from the ruins of previous civilizations, melting down old cars and industrial equipment to create new forms that serve no purpose other than to catch light in ways that might please a creature whose motivations remain completely alien. Some dragons respond to more abstract offerings. There are communities that have learned to create massive geometric patterns in the landscape using stones, earth, and vegetation, temporary art installations that can be seen from great heights and that seem to reduce the frequency of destructive visits. The people who create these patterns work like ancient ritualists, following traditions that have been developed through months of dangerous experimentation, never quite sure whether their efforts are actually effective, or whether they're simply lucky enough to be living near a dragon that would have ignored them anyway. The most disturbing tribute arrangements involve human sacrifice, though the people who practice this rarely call it by that name. In some communities, certain individuals are designated as offerings, people who walk deliberately into areas where they're likely to encounter dragons during periods of increased activity. These volunteers are usually people who have become too old or too sick to contribute to the community's survival, though occasionally they're individuals who have committed crimes serious enough to warrant expulsion. The practice is never spoken of directly, and the people who walk toward the dragons are remembered as heroes who chose to ensure the community's continued safety. Children in dragon-ruled societies are taught dragon behavior before they learn to read or write. The curriculum begins with basic recognition skills: how to distinguish between the wing beats of different species, how to interpret the various sounds that dragons make, how to read the environmental signs that indicate dragon presence in the area. Children learn to identify dragon tracks, dragon scat, and the distinctive patterns of destruction that different types of dragons leave behind. The education continues with practical survival skills that have no equivalent in the old world. Children practice moving silently across different types of terrain, learn to control their breathing to avoid detection, and develop the ability to remain perfectly still for extended periods of time. They learn which types of shelter provide the best protection against different kinds of dragon attacks, how to recognize safe routes through dangerous territory, and how to make quick decisions about when to run and when to hide. By the time they reach adolescence, children in these communities have developed an instinctive understanding of dragon behavior that would have taken researchers years to acquire in the old world. They can predict with reasonable accuracy when a dragon is likely to move through their area, what kinds of activities are most likely to attract dangerous attention, and how to modify their behavior to minimize the risk of contact. This knowledge is not taught through books or lectures, but through constant exposure to the reality of living in a world where human survival depends on understanding the habits of creatures that could end their existence without noticing they had done so. The social hierarchy in dragon-ruled communities is determined not by wealth or birthright, but by survival skills and the ability to maintain the delicate relationships that keep the community safe. The most respected individuals are those who have demonstrated the ability to read dragon behavior accurately, who have successfully guided their communities through periods of increased danger, and who have the knowledge and experience necessary to adapt to changing circumstances. Dragon speakers occupy a unique position in these societies. These are individuals who have developed the ability to predict dragon behavior with unusual accuracy, who seem to understand the patterns and motivations that drive dragon actions in ways that others cannot. Most dragon speakers are not born with these abilities, but develop them through years of careful observation and dangerous experimentation. They spend their time studying dragon movements, documenting the environmental changes that precede dragon activity, and developing theories about what drives dragon behavior. The knowledge that dragon speakers possess comes at a significant cost. Many of them have been injured during their research, carrying scars from encounters that would have killed less observant or less fortunate individuals. Others show signs of psychological stress that comes from spending too much time focused on creatures whose behavior operates according to rules that human minds are not designed to understand. The most effective dragon speakers often develop personality traits that make them difficult to live with: an obsessive attention to detail, an inability to engage in normal social interactions, and a tendency to interpret every environmental change as a potential sign of dragon activity. Those dragon speakers who survive long enough to become truly expert in their field often undergo changes that make them less recognizably human. They develop heightened senses that allow them to detect dragon presence from greater distances. But this enhanced sensitivity often comes with a corresponding inability to tolerate normal human activities and environments. They lose the ability to sleep soundly, to enjoy simple pleasures, or to maintain the kinds of personal relationships that make life worth living for most people. The communities that depend on dragon speakers often find themselves caught between gratitude for the protection. These individuals provide and discomfort with the changes that their expertise has wrought in their personalities and behavior. Dragon speakers are respected and feared in equal measure, valued for their knowledge but avoided in daily life, because their presence serves as a constant reminder of the dangers that surround the community. Justice in dragon-ruled societies operates according to principles that prioritize community survival over individual rights or abstract concepts of fairness. Laws exist primarily to prevent behaviors that might attract dragon attention or compromise the community's ability to maintain its tribute arrangements. Theft of tribute materials is considered one of the most serious crimes, punishable by expulsion or designation as an offering. Similarly, any behavior that creates excessive noise, light, or other forms of attention-attracting activity is heavily regulated and severely punished. The enforcement of these laws is handled by individuals who have demonstrated both the physical capability to impose consequences and the judgment necessary to distinguish between behaviors that threaten community survival and those that are merely antisocial. These enforcers operate with significant discretion, because the rigid application of predetermined punishments could result in decisions that compromise the community's adaptability in changing circumstances. Disputes between individuals are resolved quickly and quietly, with an emphasis on solutions that restore social harmony rather than punishing wrongdoing. The community cannot afford the luxury of extended legal proceedings or the kind of adversarial justice system that might create ongoing conflicts between community members. When conflicts cannot be resolved through mediation, the usual solution is the quiet departure of one or both parties, who leave the community to seek their fortune elsewhere rather than risk the social disruption that could make everyone less safe. The old concepts of personal freedom, individual expression, and civil liberties have become luxuries that few communities can afford. Survival requires a level of social coordination and behavioral conformity that would have been considered oppressive in the previous world. but which now represents the difference between existing and being reduced to ash and bone fragments, scattered across a landscape that no longer recognizes human presence as anything more than a temporary intrusion on dragon territory. But when that temporary intrusion ends, what remains challenges everything humans once understood about death and meaning. Death in a dragon-ruled world doesn't follow the neat timelines and predictable rituals that once allowed people to grieve properly, to say goodbye, to find closure in ceremony and shared mourning. Here, death arrives without warning and often without witnesses, leaving behind gaps in the community that can never be properly acknowledged or filled. Bodies disappear? This is perhaps the most fundamental difference between death in your world and death in the world that came before. In the old world, families could count on having remains to bury, graves to visit, physical markers that proved their loved ones had existed and mattered. Now, when someone doesn't return from a routine errand or a necessary journey, there's usually nothing left to bury except the memory of their last conversation and the space they used to occupy at the evening meal. The few bodies that are recovered rarely resemble the people they once were. Dragonfire doesn't just kill, it transforms, reducing human flesh and bone to substances that bear no recognizable relationship to the living person. The bodies that survive encounters with ice-breathing dragons are preserved in ways that make them look like sculptures carved from blue-white crystal, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise or terror that their families would prefer not to remember. Acid attacks leave behind stains on the ground that might contain traces of human remains, but there's no way to distinguish between what was once a person and what was once their clothing, tools, or possessions. Funerals happen fast when they happen at all. The funeral industry really took a hit. Turns out, elaborate memorial service and trying not to attract aerial predators are mutually exclusive business models. The traditional periods of mourning, the elaborate ceremonies that once helped communities process grief and celebrate the lives of the deceased, have become dangerous luxuries that few can afford. Gatherings of mourners create exactly the kind of visible, noisy human activity that might attract unwanted attention from above. The smoke from cremation fires, the sounds of singing or crying, the simple fact of having many people in one place for an extended period, all of these things violate the basic survival principles that keep communities alive. Most memorial services now consist of a few people meeting briefly at dawn or dusk, when the light is poor and the chances of being observed are reduced. They speak the name of the deceased, share a brief memory, and scatter a handful of ash or earth in a place that held significance for the person they're remembering. The entire ceremony lasts no more than a few minutes, and the participants separate immediately afterward, returning to their individual shelters by different routes to avoid creating the appearance of organized human activity. The traditional markers of death and remembrance have been adapted to fit the constraints of a world where permanent structures are dangerous and visible displays of human emotion are potentially fatal. Instead of headstones or elaborate monuments, the dead are remembered through small, inconspicuous markers that can be recognized by people who know what to look for but which appear meaningless to casual observation. A particular arrangement of stones, a pattern of scratches carved into an existing wall, a small object placed in a location that had personal significance. These subtle memorials serve the same function as the elaborate cemetery displays of the previous world, but without attracting the kind of attention that could endanger the living. Names are carved into stone, but not in the exposed public locations where traditional cemeteries once stood. Instead, these memorial inscriptions are hidden in places where they're unlikely to be seen by anyone except the people who specifically seek them out. Inside caves on the undersides of overhanging rocks, in the deepest corners of ruins where the shadows are thick enough to conceal human activity, these hidden walls have become the libraries of the dead, filled with hundreds of names that represent people who vanished without explanation or warning. Some believe fire purifies. This belief has evolved not from abstract theological principles, but from the practical observation that people who die in dragonfire seem to disappear completely, leaving behind no trace that might attract scavengers or create the kind of contamination that comes from decomposing remains. Families who lose loved ones to fire attacks often speak of them as having been cleansed or transformed, finding comfort in the idea that their relatives have been freed from the physical constraints that made survival so difficult and dangerous. Others think fire is a curse, the ultimate violation of human dignity and the natural order. These people point to the way that fire deaths eliminate any possibility of traditional burial or memorial practices, robbing families of the closure that comes from being able to care for the remains of their loved ones. They see dragon fire not as a merciful release, but as a form of ultimate dishonor, a denial of the basic respect that the dead deserve regardless of the circumstances of their passing. The phrase, "she was taken by wings," has become both a tragedy and a hope. It's the standard euphemism for someone who has vanished without a trace, who left their shelter one morning and never returned. The phrase acknowledges the reality of what probably happened while avoiding the explicit details that might be too painful for the bereaved to hear repeatedly. But it also carries a subtle suggestion that the person might still be alive somewhere, that they might have been carried away rather than killed, that there's still a possibility, however remote, that they might somehow return. This hope is almost always false, but it serves an important psychological function for communities that are constantly losing members to forces they can't control or predict. The possibility of survival, even when it defies logic and experience, allows people to continue functioning in circumstances that might otherwise lead to complete despair. Families hold on to the slim chance that their missing relatives might appear at the door one evening, travel-worn and injured but alive, with stories of incredible survival and dangerous journeys that ended in reunion. Children ask fewer questions about death than children once did, not because they're less curious or less affected by loss, but because they've learned that some questions don't have answers that adults can provide without breaking down completely. A child who asks, "Where did grandmother go?" might receive the standard response about wings and taking, but they rarely press for more specific information. They've learned to read the expressions on adult faces, to recognize when a subject is too dangerous or too painful to explore further. The absence of proper funeral rites has created a psychological burden that affects entire communities in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. People who grew up with the expectation that their deaths would be marked by ceremony, that their lives would be celebrated and their memories preserved through formal rituals, now face the prospect of simply vanishing one day without any acknowledgement or recognition of their passing. The knowledge that their existence might end without witness or ceremony creates a form of existential anxiety that adds another layer to the constant stress of physical survival. Dreams of the dead are common and often vivid, as if the absence of proper memorial rituals has forced the unconscious mind to create its own forms of remembrance and closure. People report dreams in which deceased relatives appear to offer advice, warnings, or simply the comfort of continued presence. These dreams are rarely peaceful. They often feature the dead as they might have appeared at the moment of their deaths, burned or frozen or transformed in ways that make them barely recognizable as the people they once were. Some communities have developed informal support systems for people who are struggling with grief in a world that doesn't allow for normal mourning processes. These groups meet in secret, sharing memories and emotions that can't be expressed safely in larger gatherings. The meetings are brief and carefully scheduled to avoid creating patterns that might be observed and interpreted as organized human activity, but they provide a crucial outlet for feelings that might otherwise lead to dangerous behaviors or complete psychological breakdown. The constant presence of death has created a culture where people form attachments more quickly, but also more tentatively than they might have in the previous world. Relationships develop with the intensity that comes from knowing they might end without warning. But they're also tinged with the emotional distance that comes from recognizing the high probability of sudden loss. People learn to love deeply, but not to depend completely, to form connections that can provide comfort and support without creating the kind of devastating grief that might make survival impossible. You learn to say goodbye every time someone leaves your sight, even for routine activities like gathering water or clearing debris from the paths. not dramatic farewells that would attract attention or create emotional displays that might compromise decision-making abilities, but internal acknowledgments that this conversation might be your last, that this shared meal might be the final time you see this person alive. The mental habit of treating every interaction as potentially final creates a heightened awareness of the value of human connection, but it also creates a form of emotional exhaustion that affects everyone who survives long enough to recognize the pattern. The dead are everywhere and nowhere, present in memory but absent from the physical world in ways that make normal grief processing almost impossible. Their voices echo in the spaces they once occupied. Their habits and preferences continue to influence daily routines. Their tools and possessions serve as constant reminders of lives that ended too soon and too suddenly. There are no bodies to visit, no graves to tend, no physical markers that confirm their existence and acknowledge their passing. In this world, the living carry the dead with them in ways that are both more intimate and more burdensome than traditional memorial practices ever required. Every survivor becomes a repository of memories, a living monument to people who left no other trace of their time in the world. The responsibility of remembrance falls entirely on those who remain, creating a form of psychological weight that grows heavier with each loss and never finds relief in the shared rituals that once helped communities process grief collectively. The culture of death in a dragon-ruled world is ultimately a culture of absence. Absence of closure, absence of ceremony, absence of the physical markers and social rituals that once helped people understand and accept the reality of loss. It's a culture built around the recognition that death is constant but unpredictable, that survival requires the ability to continue functioning despite ongoing grief, and that the luxury of proper mourning is something that belongs to a safer world that no longer exists. The weight of remembrance becomes even heavier when you realize that the weather itself has become another form of death that must be mourned. The predictable cycles of seasons that once governed agricultural planning, travel schedules, and the basic rhythms of human life have been replaced by chaotic patterns that shift according to the movements and moods of creatures, whose presence can alter the fundamental physics of atmospheric systems. Heat arrives in waves that have nothing to do with the position of the sun or the time of year. These thermal pulses radiate outward from wherever fire-breathing dragons have chosen to establish temporary residence, creating temperature gradients that can span dozens of degrees across distances that should, by all natural laws, experience similar conditions. You might wake up to a morning that feels like early spring, walk a few miles in any direction, and find yourself in air so hot it burns your lungs with each breath. The heat doesn't behave like normal heat. It clings to objects and surfaces long after the source has moved on, soaking into stone and metal and organic matter, until everything in the affected area becomes a secondary heat source that continues radiating warmth for days or weeks. Buildings become uninhabitable not because they've been damaged by fire, but because their walls and foundations have absorbed so much thermal energy that they function like ovens, slowly cooking anything inside them. Wind patterns follow no meteorological logic that human science can explain or predict. Dragons in flight create pressure systems that can generate winds strong enough to flatten trees and destroy buildings. But these winds don't follow the natural contours of the landscape or the pressure differentials that normally drive air movement. Instead, they spiral and twist in patterns that seem to be related to the wingbeat rhythms and flight paths of creatures whose aerial movements operate according to principles that have nothing to do with conventional aerodynamics. The winds carry more than just displaced air. They're filled with ash, debris, and chemical compounds that have been stirred up from the ground or produced by dragon metabolism. Breathing during windstorms requires covering your nose and mouth with cloth that has been dampened with whatever water you can spare. But even then, the air burns your throat and leaves a metallic taste that can last for hours after the wind has died down. Rain, when it comes, falls black. Weather forecasts have been simplified considerably. Today's outlook calls for a chance of acid precipitation with a side of existential dread. The water that reaches the ground has been contaminated by ash and smoke that hangs perpetually in the upper atmosphere. creating precipitation that stains everything it touches and leaves behind residues that can kill plants and sicken animals. The rain doesn't wash things clean, it makes them dirtier, coating surfaces with a thin film of acidic sludge that eats away at metal and stone and organic matter with equal persistence. Collecting rainwater for drinking requires extensive filtration systems that remove not just particulates but chemical contaminants that can cause burns, respiratory problems, and digestive issues that might not manifest for days or weeks after exposure. Most communities have given up trying to use rainwater for anything other than industrial purposes, relying instead on underground sources that might still retain some connection to the cleaner water systems that existed before dragons altered the atmospheric chemistry. Snow falls gray and acidic, accumulating in drifts that hiss and steam when they come into contact with anything warm. The snow doesn't melt cleanly. It leaves behind concentrated deposits of whatever chemicals it absorbed during its formation, creating patches of contaminated slush that can burn exposed skin and kill any vegetation that comes into contact with it. Children who once played in snow now learn to avoid it entirely, understanding that the innocent-looking drifts represent another form of environmental hazard that requires the same caution as fire or acid. Winter itself has become unpredictable, not just in timing, but in intensity and duration. Areas where ice-breathing dragons have established territory can experience winter conditions that last for months, longer than the natural seasonal cycle would suggest, with temperatures that drop far below anything that the local ecosystem evolved to handle. Plants die, animals freeze or flee, and human communities find themselves struggling to survive extended cold periods that their food stores and heating systems weren't designed to handle. Storms carry wing beats in their echoes, creating acoustic effects that make it impossible to distinguish between the sounds of natural weather and the sounds of approaching dragons. Thunder might be atmospheric electricity, or it might be the sonic boom created by something very large moving through the air faster than sound can travel. The rumbling that precedes a storm might be natural pressure changes, or it might be the ground-shaking footsteps of creatures whose weight can cause seismic activity. The uncertainty creates a form of psychological stress that affects everyone who has to make decisions about when it's safe to travel, when it's necessary to seek shelter, and when the sounds they're hearing represent natural phenomena versus approaching danger. Communities develop elaborate systems for distinguishing between different types of atmospheric disturbances, but these systems are based more on superstition and wishful thinking than on any reliable scientific principles. Crops fail with devastating regularity, not just because of direct dragon attacks on agricultural areas, but because the altered weather patterns make it impossible to predict growing seasons, rainfall amounts, or temperature ranges with any reliability. Farmers who once planned their planting schedules based on centuries of accumulated knowledge about local climate patterns now face growing conditions that change from year to year in ways that make traditional agricultural practices completely useless. People adapt to these nutritional deficiencies by eating foods they would never have considered edible in the previous world. Tree bark, roots that require extensive processing to remove toxins, insects that have proven capable of surviving in the altered environment. These protein and carbohydrate sources become essential supplements to diets that can no longer rely on traditional agricultural products. The human body adapts, but slowly and at significant cost. People who have spent years eating contaminated food and breathing polluted air develop distinctive physical characteristics: skin that looks older than their years, hair that takes on the uniform gray tint of everything else in this world, and respiratory systems that function adequately but never quite efficiently. Children who grow up in this environment often reach adulthood without ever experiencing what it feels like to breathe completely clean air, or drink water that doesn't carry at least a trace of metallic contamination. There's a smell in the air before a dragon comes. People learn to wake to it, a scent that might be ozone or sulfur or something that has no equivalent in normal human experience. The smell arrives hours or sometimes days before any visual or auditory signs of dragon presence, giving communities enough warning to implement whatever protective measures they've developed for dealing with increased danger levels. Learning to recognize this scent becomes a survival skill that's as important as knowing how to find water or start a fire. The smell has subtle variations that experienced survivors learn to interpret, different intensities that might indicate how close the dragon is, different chemical undertones that might suggest what type of dragon is approaching, different durations that might predict how long the danger period is likely to last. But the scent also serves as a constant reminder that human survival depends on the ability to detect and respond to threats that operate according to rules that humans can observe but never truly understand. The knowledge that you might wake up any morning to that distinctive smell, that any day might be the day when the approaching danger is too close or too powerful to avoid, creates a form of environmental anxiety that affects sleep patterns, decision-making processes, and the basic ability to find comfort or security in any location. Weather reports in the traditional sense no longer exist. The infrastructure that once supported meteorological prediction has been destroyed or abandoned. But more importantly, the weather itself no longer follows patterns that could be predicted using conventional atmospheric science. Instead, communities develop informal networks for sharing information about current conditions and recent observations, passing along warnings about temperature anomalies, chemical contamination levels, and dragon sightings that might affect local weather patterns. The information travels slowly and is often inaccurate by the time it reaches communities that might benefit from it. A warning about approaching acid storms might arrive hours after the storm has already passed, or temperature alerts might describe conditions that have already changed due to dragon movements that occurred after the original observation was made. But even unreliable information is better than no information at all, and communities that maintain communication networks tend to survive longer than those that try to monitor conditions entirely on their own. Seasonal celebrations have disappeared entirely from most communities, not just because the seasons themselves have become unreliable, but because the act of celebrating anything creates the kind of noise, light, and organized human activity that might attract unwanted attention. The festivals that once marked important transitions in the agricultural year, the holidays that celebrated successful harvests or the end of winter, the community gatherings that provided social cohesion and shared identity, all of these traditions have been abandoned in favor of survival practices that prioritize invisibility over social bonding. The absence of seasonal markers makes it difficult to maintain any sense of time or continuity that extends beyond the immediate challenges of daily survival. Without the reliable progression of seasons to provide structure and meaning to the passage of time, people lose track of their own ages, forget the anniversaries of important events, and struggle to maintain the kinds of long-term perspectives that once helped humans plan for the future and learn from the past. The loss of time and continuity makes it easier for fear to establish itself as the governing principle of human existence. When you can't plan for the future because you don't know what the weather will do tomorrow, when you can't commemorate the past because seasonal markers no longer exist, the only reliable constant becomes the immediate, visceral awareness that something could kill you at any moment. Everyone is afraid. Even those who pretend otherwise, who maintain stoic expressions and speak in calm voices about practical matters, carry fear in their bodies like a chronic illness that flares up at unpredictable intervals. You can see it in the way people hold their shoulders, always slightly hunched as if prepared to duck or run. You can hear it in the spaces between words, the brief pauses where someone stops speaking to listen for sounds that might indicate approaching danger. The fear is not the sharp, adrenaline-fueled terror of immediate danger, but something deeper and more pervasive. It's the fear that has time to seep into your bones, to change the way your nervous system processes every sound and movement and shift in air pressure. Your body learns to exist in a state of constant, low-level alertness that's exhausting to maintain but impossible to turn off. Because the one time you relax completely might be the time when relaxation proves fatal. Fear of speaking too loud becomes second nature, encoded into your vocal cords until whispering feels normal and anything above a conversational tone seems recklessly dangerous. Conversations happen in murmurs, with people leaning close together and speaking directly into each other's ears to avoid projecting their voices into the air, where they might be heard by creatures whose hearing operates according to frequencies and sensitivities that humans can only guess at. Children learn this vocal control before they learn to walk properly. Babies who cry too loudly or too frequently often disappear along with their families, creating a selection pressure that favors quiet children and parents who can keep their offspring silent during critical moments. The children who survive to adulthood develop voices that never quite reach full volume, speaking patterns that prioritize whispered communication over clear articulation. Fear of celebrating too openly governs every aspect of social interaction that might once have involved joy, enthusiasm, or public expression of happiness. Birthdays pass unacknowledged, achievements go unrecognized, and even small victories in the daily struggle for survival are marked only by brief, private moments of satisfaction that are never shared with others. The act of celebration requires a kind of psychological abandon that's incompatible with the constant vigilance necessary for survival. Communities that forget this restriction, that allow themselves to become too comfortable or too confident in their safety, often discover their mistake too late. There are stories, whispered stories, told only in the darkest corners of the safest shelters, about settlements that organized festivals or ceremonies or simple gatherings, where people laughed too loudly and sang too freely. These communities are remembered now only as stains on the landscape, evidence of what happens when humans fail to understand their place in the new hierarchy of existence. You never say, "It's safe today." Positive thinking has been officially reclassified as a safety hazard. The words themselves have become a form of curse, a verbal invitation for disaster to prove you wrong. People who use phrases like "everything seems calm" or "the danger has passed" often find themselves dealing with increased dragon activity within hours of making such statements. Whether this is coincidence or some form of supernatural consequence is less important than the simple fact that the correlation has been observed often enough to make everyone superstitious about expressing confidence in their security. Instead, you learn to speak about safety in terms of degrees and temporary conditions. "The sky is quiet right now," acknowledges the current lack of immediate threats while maintaining awareness that this condition could change at any moment. "We haven't seen movement today," provides information about recent observations without making any claims about what the future might hold. The language itself evolves to accommodate the reality that safety is always conditional and never guaranteed. The old stories tell of towns that got too confident, communities that began to believe they had found ways to coexist with dragons or had discovered locations that were somehow protected from dragon attention. These stories always end the same way, with descriptions of smoking ruins and scattered remains that serve as reminders of what happens when humans forget that their survival depends on remaining small, quiet, and invisible. Some of these stories might be myths, cautionary tales created to reinforce important survival behaviors rather than accurate historical accounts. But the physical evidence that supports them is scattered across the landscape in the form of ruins that show signs of sudden, complete destruction. Foundations that were melted rather than demolished, walls that were frozen solid and then shattered, and the distinctive blast patterns that mark areas where something very large and very powerful decided to express its dominance over the local geography. The fear affects children differently than adults, not because children are naturally more or less afraid, but because their developing minds adapt to constant threat in ways that fundamentally alter their psychological development. Children who grow up in this environment often develop heightened sensory abilities that allow them to detect danger signals that adults miss, but they also display reduced capacity for the kinds of emotional expression and social bonding that were once considered essential components of healthy childhood development. These children rarely smile spontaneously, not because they're necessarily unhappy, but because their faces have learned to maintain neutral expressions that don't attract attention or signal the presence of human emotion to observers who might be watching from above. They play games that would seem deeply disturbing to people from the previous world, games that involve practicing death poses, competing to see who can remain motionless the longest, and elaborate scenarios based on different types of dragon encounters and survival strategies. Adult relationships develop under the constant pressure of knowing that emotional investment in another person creates vulnerability that might compromise survival decisions. People form partnerships and friendships, but these relationships are often characterized by a kind of emotional reserve that allows for quick separation if circumstances require one partner to sacrifice themselves for the other's survival. Love exists, but it's love that has been tempered by the practical reality that attachment can become a liability when survival requires immediate, ruthless decision-making. The fear creates hierarchies that have nothing to do with traditional forms of social status or economic power. The people who command the most respect and authority are those who have demonstrated the ability to sense danger before others recognize it, who have survived multiple close encounters with dragons, and who have developed the combination of knowledge and instinct necessary to make split-second decisions about when to run, when to hide, and when to accept that death is inevitable. These survivors often develop personality traits that make them difficult to live with during periods of relative calm. Their hypervigilance, essential for detecting threats, makes them respond to normal social interactions as if they were potential dangers. Their ability to make quick survival decisions often translates into impatience with democratic processes or collaborative decision-making that might delay responses to emergencies. Their experience with life-or-death situations makes them dismissive of concerns that seem trivial by comparison, even when those concerns are important for maintaining the social cohesion necessary for long-term community survival. Fear of the unknown compounds the fear of known threats, because dragons represent a form of danger that operates according to rules that humans can observe but never fully understand. The inability to predict dragon behavior with any reliability means that every decision about when to travel, where to build, how to organize daily activities, must be made with the awareness that the reasoning behind the decision might be completely wrong. This uncertainty creates a psychological burden that goes beyond the simple fear of death. People can learn to accept the possibility of dying, but it's much more difficult to accept the possibility that your death might result from a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time but was based on incomplete or incorrect understanding of the forces that determine whether you live or die in any given situation. The constant presence of fear changes the way communities organize themselves for mutual support and protection. Traditional forms of leadership, based on charisma, intelligence, or administrative ability, give way to hierarchies organized around survival skills and threat assessment abilities. Decisions are made not through debate or consensus building, but through quick consultations with whoever has the most relevant experience for the specific type of danger being faced. Social institutions that once provided stability and continuity, schools, religious organizations, cultural groups, either disappear entirely or transform into training organizations focused exclusively on survival skills and dragon-related knowledge. The complex social structures that once supported artistic expression, intellectual development, and spiritual exploration are replaced by simpler systems, designed to maximize the chances that enough people will survive each day to maintain the basic functions necessary for continued existence. Music dies first. The instruments that once filled homes with melody now sit silent, their strings removed or deliberately damaged to prevent the accidental sounds that could carry beyond safe walls. Singing becomes a memory, humming a dangerous habit that must be unlearned. The songs that once marked celebrations, mourning, love, and community gathering fade from memory as surely as if they had never existed. Fear becomes the primary tool for social control, not because leaders deliberately use it to maintain power, but because communities that fail to maintain appropriate levels of fear tend to make mistakes that result in their complete destruction. The people who survive long enough to become leaders are those who have internalized fear so completely that they can no longer distinguish between necessary caution and paralyzing anxiety. The result is societies that function efficiently for the specific purpose of avoiding immediate destruction, but which have lost most of the characteristics that once made human civilization worth preserving. Art, music, literature, philosophy, all of the cultural achievements that once distinguished human society from simple, survival-focused animal behavior, become luxuries that few communities can afford and fewer still can justify when every resource must be devoted to the immediate challenges of staying alive for one more day. Fear rules not through explicit commandments or formal systems of punishment, but through the simple fact that it has proven to be the most reliable guide for making decisions that result in continued existence. In a world where the margin for error has shrunk to nearly zero, where a single mistake can result in the complete annihilation of everything you've worked to protect, fear becomes not just an emotion but a survival tool that's as essential as shelter, food, or water. When fear becomes your most essential survival tool, the social structures that emerge around it stop resembling anything that would have been recognizable as civilization in the world that came before. The communities that survive develop hierarchies based not on inherited status or accumulated wealth, but on the brutal practicality of who can keep the most people alive for the longest period of time. Nobles, in the traditional sense, no longer exist. The concept of leadership based on bloodline or birthright becomes meaningless when survival depends on skills that must be learned through direct experience with life-threatening situations. The people who end up in positions of authority are those who have demonstrated the ability to read dragon behavior accurately, to make quick decisions under pressure, and to maintain the kind of emotional control that prevents panic from spreading through a community during crisis situations. These new leaders trade in survival rather than luxury goods or political influence. Their wealth is measured in knowledge about safe routes between settlements, information about dragon movement patterns, and relationships with other communities that might provide mutual aid during emergencies. They maintain their status not through the accumulation of material possessions, but through their ability to continue providing the guidance and protection that keeps their followers alive. The deals they cut are not political alliances or trade agreements, but arrangements that directly impact the survival odds of everyone involved. A leader might negotiate with another community to share information about dragon sightings in exchange for access to water sources that haven't been contaminated by acid rain. They might arrange for the temporary shelter of refugees from a destroyed settlement in exchange for the specialized knowledge those refugees possess about surviving in areas with specific types of dragon activity. These negotiations happen quickly and quietly, often through intermediaries, who can travel between communities without attracting the kind of attention that formal diplomatic missions might generate. The agreements that result from these negotiations are binding not because of legal enforcement mechanisms, but because breaking them could result in the death of everyone who depends on the cooperation for their continued survival. The secrets they keep are not state secrets or commercial intelligence, but information about dragon weaknesses, safe locations, and survival techniques that could save lives if shared widely, but which lose their effectiveness if too many people know about them. A hiding place that can shelter a few people might become useless if word spreads and too many refugees try to use it simultaneously. A technique for avoiding detection might stop working if dragons learn to recognize it through repeated exposure. Host rituals develop around the complex process of integrating newcomers into established communities without compromising the survival strategies that have kept the community alive. These rituals serve both practical and psychological functions, testing whether newcomers can adapt to the behavioral requirements of the community, while also providing existing members with reassurance that their carefully developed survival systems won't be disrupted by people who don't understand the local dangers. The rituals might involve periods of silent observation, where newcomers must demonstrate their ability to remain motionless and quiet for extended periods without attracting attention. They might include tests of the newcomer's ability to recognize dragon sign, to respond appropriately to various types of danger signals, or to make quick decisions about when to help others and when self-preservation must take priority. Peasants in this new social order are not agricultural workers or craftspeople, but anyone whose primary contribution to community survival involves following instructions rather than making decisions. The class system has been streamlined. There are people who give survival orders and people who follow them, and the performance review process is refreshingly immediate. These people do not question the orders they receive, not because they lack intelligence or curiosity, but because questioning takes time that might not be available when immediate action is required to avoid catastrophe. They listen for wings with the same intensity that people in the previous world once listened for sirens or alarms that indicated emergency situations. Their ears become trained to distinguish between different types of wing beats, to recognize the acoustic signatures that indicate whether an approaching dragon is likely to pass overhead or land nearby, and to interpret the subtle changes in wing beat patterns that might suggest changes in dragon behavior or intention. The listening is not passive but active, requiring constant attention and immediate readiness to respond to what they hear. A change in the rhythm of distant wing beats might indicate that a dragon has noticed something interesting on the ground. A shift in the direction of the sound might suggest that the dragon is changing course toward or away from the community. The cessation of wing beat sounds might mean that the dragon has landed nearby, requiring immediate implementation of whatever protocols the community has developed for dealing with ground-based dragon presence. Dragon speakers occupy a unique and dangerous position in this social hierarchy. These are individuals who have developed the ability to interpret dragon behavior with unusual accuracy, but who pay a significant price for this knowledge. They are chosen not through democratic processes or hereditary succession, but through a combination of demonstrated ability and survival of experiences that kill most people who attempt them. Most dragon speakers die young, not because they're deliberately sacrificed or sent on suicide missions, but because the process of developing their abilities requires exposure to dragons under circumstances that have extremely high mortality rates. Learning to read dragon behavior accurately means observing dragons closely enough and frequently enough to recognize patterns that are invisible to casual observation. This kind of close observation requires taking risks that most sensible people avoid. The ones who don't die young often become changed in ways that make them less recognizably human. Their nervous systems adapt to the constant stress of dragon proximity, developing heightened sensitivity to environmental changes that allows them to detect dragon presence from greater distances, but which also makes them hypersensitive to normal human activities and social interactions. They might develop the ability to sense dragon approach hours before anyone else in the community becomes aware of the danger, but this enhanced sensitivity often comes with the inability to sleep soundly, to enjoy physical comfort, or to form normal emotional relationships with other people. Their bodies learn to process information about dragon activity so efficiently that they become walking early warning systems. But they also become people who can no longer function normally during periods when there is no immediate threat to monitor and respond to. Justice in this social order operates according to principles that prioritize community survival over individual rights or abstract concepts of fairness. The legal system, such as it exists, focuses on preventing behaviors that might compromise the community's ability to maintain its survival strategies, rather than on punishing wrongdoing or compensating victims of harmful actions. Survival is the only form of justice that matters in any practical sense. Individual grievances, personal conflicts, and disputes over resources or responsibilities are resolved according to what will best serve the community's long-term survival prospects, rather than what might be fair to the individuals involved. A person who has been wronged by another community member might find that seeking justice requires actions that would endanger everyone, making forgiveness or ignoring the injury the only socially acceptable response. The enforcement of community survival rules happens through mechanisms that are both more immediate and more permanent than traditional legal punishments. People who repeatedly engage in behaviors that endanger others are not imprisoned or fined but excluded from the community, forced to survive on their own in an environment where individual survival is nearly impossible. The exclusion serves both as punishment for past behavior and as protection for the community against future risks. But it's also essentially a death sentence carried out through abandonment rather than execution. Nothing else matters beyond the basic mathematics of survival. How many people can the community support with its available resources? How many people are required to maintain essential functions like food gathering and shelter maintenance? And how many people can be safely housed in the available hiding places if dragons decide to take a closer interest in the area? All social policies, all resource allocation decisions, all choices about who gets help and who must be left to fend for themselves are ultimately determined by these simple calculations that reduce human worth to survival utility. The cold mathematics of survival become even more brutal when illness or injury enters the calculation. In a world where every person's contribution to community survival can mean the difference between life and death for everyone else, sickness is not just a personal tragedy, but a threat to the entire social structure that keeps people alive. Burn care represents the most common form of medical treatment, not because people are careless around fire, but because dragon encounters leave survivors with injuries that range from minor heat exposure to catastrophic tissue damage that would have required specialized hospital treatment in the previous world. The medical response to these injuries is crude but functional. Aloe scraped from plants that somehow survive in the contaminated soil, clay mixed with water to create cooling poultices, and prayers whispered quietly enough to avoid attracting attention to the location where injured people are being treated. The aloe that grows in this environment is not the same plant that once provided gentle relief for sunburns and minor skin irritation. Exposure to contaminated soil and acidic precipitation has altered its chemical composition, making it more potent but also more unpredictable in its effects. Sometimes it provides genuine relief from burn pain and seems to promote healing. Other times it causes allergic reactions or chemical burns that make the original injury worse. But it's the only topical treatment available, so people use it despite the risks and hope that this time it will help rather than harm. Clay becomes a universal medical supply not because of any particular healing properties, but because it's one of the few substances that remains relatively uncontaminated and can be safely applied to open wounds without introducing additional toxins or infectious agents. The clay is mixed with the cleanest water available, usually water that has been boiled and filtered multiple times to remove as many contaminants as possible. The resulting paste provides some protection against infection and helps to regulate the temperature of burned tissue, but it's a primitive treatment that would have been considered inadequate for treating serious burns even in medieval times. Prayers accompany medical treatment not because people believe in divine intervention, but because the act of praying provides a psychological framework for dealing with injuries that are beyond the scope of available medical knowledge and resources. The prayers are whispered rather than spoken aloud, because gathering to pray for the sick creates exactly the kind of group activity that might attract unwanted attention from creatures that associate human gatherings with opportunity for easy prey. Infections develop from sources that would have been easily preventable or treatable in the world before dragons. Ash inhalation causes respiratory problems that begin as simple irritation but progress to serious lung damage when people are forced to breathe contaminated air for extended periods without access to clean environments or proper medical care. The ash particles embed themselves in lung tissue, creating chronic inflammation that makes breathing difficult and reduces the body's ability to process oxygen efficiently. Venom exposure occurs not from direct contact with dragons, but from the secondary contamination that results when dragon saliva, blood, or other bodily fluids come into contact with water sources, food supplies, or surfaces that humans touch during their daily activities. The venom doesn't kill quickly, but it causes gradual organ damage that manifests as fatigue, digestive problems, and neurological symptoms that make it difficult for affected individuals to perform the physically and mentally demanding tasks required for survival. Crushed limbs result from the debris that constantly falls from structures damaged by dragon activity, from the ground tremors that occur when something very heavy lands nearby, and from the simple fact that people are forced to travel through unstable environments where rock slides, building collapses, and other structural failures are common occurrences. The treatment for these injuries consists primarily of splinting broken bones with whatever materials are available and hoping that the bones heal correctly without access to X-rays, surgical intervention, or proper rehabilitation equipment. No hospitals exist because hospitals require infrastructure, resources, and staffing levels that no community can maintain while also meeting the basic survival needs of its population. Healthcare has been simplified to, did you survive the thing that happened to you? If yes, you're discharged. The buildings that once housed medical facilities have been destroyed or abandoned, and the specialized equipment that once made modern medical care possible has been lost to dragon attacks, environmental contamination, or simple mechanical failure without access to replacement parts or technical support. Instead of hospitals, communities rely on healers who have learned to treat common injuries and illnesses using whatever resources are locally available. These healers are not doctors in any sense that would have been recognized in the previous world, but people who have accumulated practical experience, treating the types of medical problems that are most common in their specific environment. Their knowledge is based on trial and error rather than scientific training, and their success rates are limited by the crude tools and contaminated supplies they have to work with. The silence that surrounds medical treatment serves multiple purposes. Injured people must suppress signs of pain that might attract attention from predators or scavengers that are drawn to the sound and smell of wounded prey. Healers must work without the benefit of discussing symptoms or treatment options with colleagues, because medical consultations require forms of communication that could be overheard by creatures, whose hearing operates according to frequencies and sensitivity levels that humans can only guess at. If you hear screaming from the far hut, you don't check. This rule exists not because people lack compassion or concern for their neighbors, but because investigating sounds of distress creates risks that could endanger everyone in the community. The screaming might indicate that someone is receiving medical treatment for injuries that are too severe to treat without causing pain. It might mean that someone has been infected with a disease that causes delirium or loss of behavioral control. Or it might mean that the hut has been breached by something that killed the occupants and is now using their voices to attract additional prey. You close your door instead of investigating, because opening your door creates light, sound, and movement that could attract attention to your location. You remain in your shelter and listen carefully to determine whether the sounds indicate a situation that requires community response or a situation that requires everyone to remain hidden until the danger passes. The decision about when to help others and when to prioritize your own survival is one that every person in this world must make repeatedly, and the people who survive are those who learn to make these decisions based on practical assessments of risk rather than emotional responses to human suffering. Medical emergencies often go untreated not because people lack the desire to help, but because providing help requires exposing multiple people to risks that might result in casualties that exceed whatever benefit the medical intervention might provide. The mathematics of medical care become as brutal as every other aspect of survival. How many people can afford to risk their lives to save one injured person? And how do you weigh the value of one person's survival against the increased danger to everyone else that results from mounting a rescue or providing treatment? The diseases that spread through communities are often new strains that have evolved in response to the environmental changes caused by dragon presence. Traditional remedies prove ineffective against illnesses that have developed resistance to known treatments, and the symptoms of these new diseases often mimic the effects of environmental contamination, making it difficult to distinguish between illnesses that might respond to medical treatment and poisoning that requires completely different interventions. People learn to live with chronic health problems that would have been easily treatable in the previous world, accepting reduced lung capacity, persistent pain, and gradual organ damage as normal conditions that must be endured rather than medical problems that should be solved. The standard of health shifts from optimal physical function to simply maintaining whatever level of capability is necessary to perform essential survival tasks. The shift from treating optimal health to merely maintaining survival capability means that death, when it comes, rarely resembles the peaceful endings that people once hoped for, or the dramatic heroic deaths that stories once celebrated. Death in a dragon-ruled world is usually sudden, often pointless, and almost always preventable if the world were different than it is. Fire kills more people than any other single cause, but not in the clean, quick way that movies once portrayed. Dragon fire doesn't burn you, it transforms you, breaking down the molecular bonds that hold your body together until you become something that no longer resembles human remains. The people who die this way simply disappear, leaving behind only shadows burned into nearby surfaces and trace minerals that were once part of their bone structure mixed into the ash that covers everything. The lucky ones lose consciousness before the transformation is complete. Death certificates have been reduced to a single checkbox. Cause of death: Tuesday. Their nervous systems shut down from the shock of tissue damage that exceeds anything the human body evolved to survive. But others remain aware long enough to understand what's happening to them, to feel their flesh liquefying and their bones dissolving while their brains continue to process sensory information that has no evolutionary precedent in human experience. Falling debris accounts for almost as many deaths as direct dragon attacks, but these casualties develop more slowly and often go unnoticed until it's too late to provide any meaningful help. A piece of masonry that strikes someone in the head might cause internal bleeding that takes hours or days to prove fatal. A collapsed wall might pin someone underneath rubble in a location where their calls for help can't be heard, leading to death by dehydration or exposure rather than immediate crushing injuries. These debris-related deaths are particularly cruel because they often occur to people who survived the initial dragon encounter that caused the structural damage. Someone who successfully hid from a dragon attack might emerge from their shelter only to be struck by stone that continues falling hours after the dragon has moved on. The delayed nature of these casualties means that periods of apparent safety can suddenly become dangerous without any warning signs that would allow people to protect themselves. Crush injuries result not just from falling objects, but from the ground vibrations that occur when something weighing several tons moves across terrain that wasn't designed to support that kind of weight. Buildings that seem structurally sound can collapse suddenly when the foundation shifts due to pressure waves traveling through the earth. People who take shelter in basements or underground spaces sometimes find themselves trapped when the exits are blocked by debris from structures that collapse above them. The most disturbing aspect of crush-related deaths is that they often occur to people who made exactly the right decisions based on the information available to them. Someone who seeks shelter in what appears to be the safest available location might die because they couldn't predict that a dragon would choose to land directly above their hiding place. The arbitrary nature of these deaths creates a form of psychological trauma for survivors who realize that their own survival was largely a matter of luck rather than skill or preparation. Fear itself becomes a cause of death when the stress of constant vigilance overwhelms the body's ability to maintain basic physiological functions. People die of heart attacks brought on by the sudden shock of dragon encounters, even when the dragon poses no immediate threat to their location. Others die of strokes caused by the elevated blood pressure that results from months or years of living in a state of constant alertness. These fear-related deaths are often the most tragic because they occur to people who have successfully survived multiple dangerous encounters and developed the skills necessary to avoid direct confrontation with dragons. Their bodies simply wear out from the constant strain of processing threat information and maintaining readiness to respond to emergencies that might never come. Some vanish during errands that should have been routine and safe according to all available information about local dragon activity. They leave their shelters in the morning to gather water or deliver messages and simply never return, leaving behind no trace that would indicate what happened to them or where their remains might be found. These disappearances are perhaps the most psychologically difficult for communities to process, because they provide no closure and no information that might help prevent similar losses in the future. The families of people who vanish often spend months or years hoping for some sign that their loved ones are still alive somewhere, perhaps injured or lost but potentially recoverable. This hope is almost always false, but it serves a psychological function that allows people to continue functioning while dealing with losses that can't be properly grieved, because there's no physical evidence that death has actually occurred. Others walk toward dragons willingly, not because they're suicidal or mentally ill, but because they've reached a point where the psychological burden of constant fear becomes more unbearable than the prospect of certain death. These voluntary encounters with dragons usually happen to people who have lost family members or witnessed destruction that exceeded their ability to process the trauma and continue functioning normally. The people who choose this form of death often do so during periods when their communities are facing particular hardship or danger, framing their decision as a form of sacrifice that might divert dragon attention away from other community members. Whether this reasoning has any basis in reality is less important than the psychological framework it provides for making a decision that would otherwise seem purely self-destructive. The worst deaths aren't loud or dramatic, but quiet and unwitnessed. People who die alone in their shelters from illness, injury, or simple exhaustion often aren't discovered until days or weeks later, when their absence from community activities becomes noticeable enough to warrant investigation. By that time, decomposition has usually progressed to the point where determining the cause of death becomes impossible. These solitary deaths represent failures of the social support systems that communities try to maintain despite the constraints imposed by survival requirements. Someone who dies alone might have been saved if their condition had been discovered earlier, but checking on isolated community members requires forms of movement and communication that could attract unwanted attention to the locations where vulnerable people are housed. You dream of living long enough to die of something human, old age, heart disease, cancer, or any of the familiar causes of death that once represented the natural end of a well-lived life rather than premature termination due to environmental hazards beyond human control. The prospect of dying from causes related to normal human aging processes becomes a luxury that seems almost impossibly optimistic. The deaths that haunt your dreams are not the dramatic ones involving direct dragon encounters, but the quiet, mundane deaths that result from the slow degradation of human health and social structures under constant environmental pressure. These are deaths that could have been prevented with access to basic medical care, adequate nutrition, or simply the ability to live without constant stress and fear. The people who die of human causes in this world are usually the very old or the very young, individuals whose bodies are not strong enough to handle the environmental stresses that have become part of daily existence for everyone else. Their deaths provide a reminder of what mortality looked like when humans had control over their environment and could expect to live long enough for their bodies to wear out through normal aging rather than external violence. The deaths of the very old and very young mark the boundaries of a shortened human lifespan, but it's the transformation of childhood itself that represents the most profound change in what it means to be human in this world. The concept of innocence, the idea that children should be protected from adult concerns and allowed to develop gradually through stages of increasing responsibility, has become a luxury that no community can afford when survival depends on every person understanding their role in avoiding collective annihilation. Children don't play in any sense that would have been recognizable in the world before dragons. Hide and seek has evolved into the world's most consequential game, where losing means something considerably worse than being it. The spontaneous, imaginative activities that once characterized healthy childhood development have been replaced by training exercises, designed to develop the specific skills and behavioral patterns that will keep them alive long enough to reach adulthood. What might look like play to an outside observer is actually a form of education that uses game-like activities to teach essential survival knowledge. The games they do play would seem deeply disturbing to people who remember when childhood was supposed to be a time of joy and discovery rather than preparation for a lifetime of constant danger. Children compete to see who can remain perfectly still for the longest periods of time, developing the ability to control their breathing, suppress involuntary movements, and ignore physical discomfort that might cause them to shift position in ways that could attract unwanted attention. They practice death poses with the same intensity that children in the previous world once brought to sports or artistic activities, learning to collapse instantly and convincingly, to lie motionless even when experiencing pain or fear, and to control involuntary responses like crying or calling out, becomes a fundamental skill that might save their lives if they're ever caught in the open when a dragon decides to investigate what appears to be human activity. These practice sessions happen in silence, with children learning to communicate through subtle gestures and facial expressions that won't create sounds or movements large enough to be detected by creatures whose sensory capabilities operate according to principles that humans can observe but never fully understand. The ability to coordinate group activities without speaking becomes as important as any academic skill that children once learned in formal educational settings. Toys, when they exist at all, are wooden dragons that have been carved, burned, and repainted to reflect the various types of dragons that the children might encounter during their lifetimes. These toy dragons serve multiple educational purposes. They help children learn to recognize different dragon species from a distance. They provide a safe way to practice appropriate responses to various types of dragon encounters. And they serve as props for elaborate scenarios that teach decision-making skills related to survival situations. The dragons are burned and repainted repeatedly because this process teaches children about the impermanence of all human creations in a world where anything that humans build can be destroyed without warning. Each time a toy dragon is damaged and repaired, children learn something new about resilience, adaptation, and the importance of maintaining essential functions, even when the materials and resources available for those functions are constantly changing. The repainting process also serves as a form of artistic expression that's been adapted to fit the constraints of a world where bright colors and elaborate decorations could attract unwanted attention. Children learn to work with pigments that blend with the ash-gray palette that dominates their environment, developing aesthetic sensibilities that prioritize camouflage and concealment over beauty or self-expression. Lullabies have been transformed from gentle songs designed to comfort children and help them sleep into educational tools that teach important safety, information through repetitive verses that children can memorize and recall even when they're frightened or confused. The songs include warnings about tail shadows, the distinctive patterns of darkness that precede the arrival of ground-walking dragons, and instructions about how to interpret wing hum, the low-frequency sound that flying dragons produce and that can be detected by human hearing long before the dragons themselves become visible. These lullabies are sung quietly, often whispered directly into a child's ear rather than performed aloud in ways that might carry beyond the immediate family group. The melodies are designed to be soothing enough to help children sleep despite their frightening content. But the words are chosen specifically to implant survival information into developing minds at an age when children are most receptive to learning through song and repetition. The psychological impact of growing up with lullabies that contain explicit warnings about mortal danger creates adults who can never fully relax, even during periods of apparent safety. The songs that once provided comfort and security become associated with vigilance and threat assessment, eliminating one of the few sources of unconditional peace that children once experienced during their early development. The absence of birthday celebrations reflects not just the practical difficulties of organizing gatherings that might attract attention, but also the reality that marking the passage of time through personal milestones becomes psychologically problematic when the likelihood of reaching the next milestone is genuinely uncertain. Children learn not to anticipate future celebrations or to attach emotional significance to personal anniversaries that might never arrive. Instead of birthday cakes, children receive practical gifts that contribute to their survival capabilities, improved clothing that provides better protection against environmental hazards, tools that are sized appropriately for their developing strength and coordination, or access to advanced training that will increase their chances of surviving encounters with specific types of dragons. The sweetness that once characterized childhood, both literally, in terms of access to candy and desserts, and figuratively, in terms of protection from adult concerns, has been replaced by the bitter taste of ash that children learn to associate with safety. Sweet foods attract insects and small animals that might in turn attract larger predators, making sugar a dangerous luxury that responsible parents can't afford to provide even when it's available. Children develop adult-level understanding of complex survival strategies before they develop the emotional maturity necessary to cope with the psychological implications of living in constant danger. They can make life-or-death decisions with remarkable competence, but they often lack the emotional resilience necessary to process the long-term consequences of those decisions, or to maintain hope for a future that extends beyond immediate survival needs. The result is a generation that possesses extraordinary practical skills, but limited capacity for the kinds of emotional expression, creative thinking, and social bonding that once characterized healthy human development. These children survive to adulthood at higher rates than would have been possible if they had been raised according to traditional child-rearing practices, but they reach adulthood as fundamentally different kinds of humans than their parents were at the same age. Education happens through direct exposure to dangerous situations rather than through classroom instruction or guided practice in safe environments. Children learn about dragon behavior by observing actual dragons from concealed positions, developing their knowledge through experiences that would have been considered criminally negligent child endangerment in the previous world, but which now represent the most effective way to prepare young people for the realities they'll face as adults. The childhood that emerges from these conditions produces adults who are highly capable of surviving in their specific environment, but who lack many of the psychological and social skills that once made human civilization worth preserving. They are efficient survival machines who retain some human characteristics, but who have been shaped by their environment into something that represents an adaptation to circumstances rather than a continuation of traditional human culture and values. The adults who emerge from this transformed childhood find themselves grappling with questions of meaning and purpose that have no precedent in human, religious, or philosophical tradition. The spiritual frameworks that once helped people understand their place in the universe were built around assumptions about human dignity, divine protection, and natural order that no longer apply when survival depends on accepting your position as prey in a food chain, dominated by creatures whose motivations operate beyond human comprehension. Dragon cults develop not from reverence or admiration, but from the desperate need to find some framework for understanding experiences that exceed the capacity of traditional religious concepts to explain or comfort. These cults are less about worship in any conventional sense and more about developing practical approaches to living, with forces that are simultaneously natural and supernatural, predictable in some ways but utterly alien in others. The ceremonies that emerge around dragon worship are designed to serve psychological functions rather than to communicate with beings that show no interest in human spiritual needs or moral development. Participants use ritual activities to process trauma, to create shared meaning from experiences that would otherwise remain isolated and incomprehensible, and to develop group cohesion around the shared challenge of surviving encounters with creatures that represent everything humans fear about their own insignificance. Fire rites become central to many of these religious practices, not because fire is considered sacred, but because learning to control your responses to fire becomes essential for survival in a world where dragon fire represents the most common cause of death. The rites involve controlled exposure to heat and flame under circumstances that allow participants to practice maintaining emotional and physical control while experiencing the sensory conditions that they might face during actual dragon encounters. These fire ceremonies serve as both spiritual practice and practical training, teaching people to override their natural flight responses to extreme heat while also providing a ritualized context for confronting the reality that they live in constant proximity to forces that could end their existence without warning or malice. The psychological preparation that results from these practices can mean the difference between panic and effective response if someone finds themselves in the presence of dragon fire. Wing prayers represent attempts to develop spiritual practices that acknowledge the reality of living under the constant threat of aerial predators. These prayers are not requests for protection or intervention, but meditative exercises designed to help people maintain psychological equilibrium while living with the knowledge that death could arrive from above at any moment without regard for their moral character, spiritual development, or contributions to their communities. The prayers involve specific breathing patterns and mental exercises that help people process the sound of wing beats without triggering panic responses that could compromise their ability to make rational decisions about when to seek shelter and when to remain motionless. The spiritual dimension of these practices emerges from the recognition that surviving in this world requires developing a form of acceptance that goes beyond normal human psychological resources. Some worship the oldest dragons, developing religious frameworks based on the theory that creatures which have survived for centuries or millennia must possess forms of wisdom that humans can learn to appreciate even if they can never understand them directly. These worship practices involve studying dragon behavior patterns, learning to recognize individual dragons based on their distinctive characteristics, and developing theories about dragon motivations that provide believers with a sense of connection to forces that might otherwise seem completely random and meaningless. The worship doesn't involve attempts to communicate with dragons or to influence their behavior through prayer or offering, but rather focuses on developing human understanding of dragon nature as a path toward spiritual enlightenment. Believers find meaning in the process of observing and interpreting dragon activity, treating their survival as evidence that they're developing the kind of wisdom that allows them to coexist with superior beings. Others hide from dragons while developing religious practices based on the belief that salvation comes through invisibility and humility rather than through understanding or coexistence. These religious communities focus on developing spiritual practices that emphasize self-denial, reduction of material needs, and the cultivation of psychological states that minimize the human presence that might attract dragon attention. Their religious exercises involve practices that would have been considered extreme asceticism in the previous world, but which serve practical survival functions in a world where any expression of human vitality could prove fatal. They fast to reduce the sounds and smells associated with human metabolism, practice meditation techniques that slow their breathing and heart rate to levels that might be harder for predators to detect, and develop philosophical frameworks that treat survival itself as a form of spiritual achievement. A few believe dragons are gods, developing theological systems that attempt to understand dragon behavior as expressions of divine will that humans should strive to interpret and obey. These believers treat dragon attacks not as random, natural disasters, but as forms of divine communication that contain messages about human behavior, community organization, or spiritual development that can be decoded through careful study and faithful response. The practical implications of this belief system involve treating all dragon activity as potentially meaningful, developing complex interpretive frameworks for understanding what different types of dragon behavior might signify, and organizing community life around attempts to respond appropriately to what believers perceive as divine guidance expressed through dragon actions. Others believe dragons are punishment for human arrogance or environmental destruction, developing religious practices focused on atonement, collective guilt, and the hope that sufficient human suffering might eventually satisfy whatever cosmic justice system brought dragons into the world as agents of correction or revenge. These communities organize their spiritual lives around concepts of deserved suffering, viewing their survival struggles as necessary penance for the sins of previous generations. Their religious practices emphasize acceptance of hardship, collective responsibility for humanity's past mistakes, and the cultivation of humility as both a spiritual virtue and a practical survival strategy. You just pray they pass overhead without noticing? Prayer requests have become remarkably specific. Please let that shadow be a cloud. And if it's not a cloud, please let it be someone else's problem. This represents perhaps the most common form of religious practice in dragon-ruled communities. Simple, desperate appeals to whatever forces might influence dragon behavior, offered without much hope for a response but maintained because the alternative is accepting that human survival depends entirely on random chance. These prayers are whispered during dragon encounters, repeated silently during periods of apparent safety, and shared quietly among community members as a form of mutual psychological support. The prayers don't follow any formal theological structure but emerge spontaneously from the immediate need to find some way of processing experiences that exceed normal human capacity for understanding or acceptance. The spiritual landscape that emerges from these conditions bears little resemblance to the organized religions that once provided structure and meaning for human communities. Instead of offering comfort, hope, or guidance toward moral development, these new religious practices focus on helping people maintain sanity while living with conditions that challenge every assumption about human dignity, divine protection, and natural justice that once formed the foundation of spiritual belief. Faith becomes a survival tool rather than a source of transcendent meaning, providing psychological frameworks for enduring experiences that would otherwise result in complete despair or psychological breakdown. The measure of religious success is not enlightenment or moral improvement, but simply the ability to continue functioning as a human being, while living under conditions that seem designed to strip away everything that once made human existence seem meaningful or worthwhile. When faith becomes merely another survival tool, people begin searching for more tangible forms of hope, for evidence that human agency might still play a role in determining outcomes in a world where most events seem governed by forces beyond human influence or understanding. This search inevitably leads to stories about the possibility of establishing meaningful relationships with dragons, legends that offer the tantalizing prospect that humans might somehow transcend their status as prey and achieve a form of partnership with the creatures that dominate their world. The legends say you can bond with dragons, form connections that bridge the enormous gap between human consciousness and whatever form of intelligence guides dragon behavior. These stories circulate in whispered conversations during the safest hours of the night, passed between communities through networks of travelers who risk their lives to maintain communication across territories that have been carved up by dragon presence into isolated pockets of human habitation. According to these legends, the bonding process requires a combination of courage, wisdom, and some indefinable quality that allows certain individuals to communicate with dragons on levels that transcend normal human sensory capabilities. The stories describe people who approached dragons without fear, who offered themselves as companions rather than prey, and who somehow convinced creatures capable of casual destruction to accept them as partners in activities that benefit both species. But no one ever has. The success rate for dragon friendship initiatives remains at a solid 0%, though the sample size keeps getting smaller for some reason. The gap between legend and reality becomes apparent when you examine the actual evidence for successful dragon bonding, which consists entirely of stories told by people who weren't present during the alleged events, accounts that have been passed through multiple retellings, and claims made by individuals whose mental state makes their testimony questionable at best. The absence of verifiable examples of successful dragon bonding doesn't prevent people from continuing to believe in the possibility, because the alternative, accepting that humans will never be anything more than tolerated pests in a world ruled by creatures who don't acknowledge human existence as meaningful, represents a form of despair that few people can sustain while continuing to function in their daily lives. Dragon riders exist only in fables and ghost stories, tales that might have originated from misunderstood sightings of people who were carried away by dragons rather than transported by them. The distinction between being a passenger and being prey becomes meaningless when viewed from the ground, where witnesses see only a human figure associated with dragonflight, without being able to determine the nature of that association or the condition of the person involved. The stories that grow from these sightings become increasingly elaborate as they're retold, incorporating details about saddles and harnesses, communication between rider and mount, and cooperative activities that suggest mutual understanding and shared purpose. But the physical evidence for such equipment is non-existent, and the supposed riders never return to share their experiences or teach others how to achieve similar relationships with dragons. The persistence of dragon rider legends reflects the deep human need to believe that intelligence and determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, that the qualities that once allowed humans to dominate their environment might still provide pathways to partnership with creatures that now dominate them. The legends serve important psychological functions even when they have no basis in reality, providing hope and motivation for people who might otherwise succumb to the despair that comes from accepting complete powerlessness. Some try to establish contact with dragons despite the overwhelming evidence that such attempts end in death or worse. These individuals are usually people who have lost family members to dragon attacks, and who convince themselves that their personal tragedy provides them with special insight into dragon nature or creates obligations that dragons might be willing to acknowledge and respect. The attempts typically involve approaching known dragon territories with offerings of food, valuables, or personal possessions that the would-be communicator hopes might demonstrate human intelligence and peaceful intentions. The logic behind these attempts is based on assumptions about dragon psychology that have no supporting evidence but which provide the only framework available for imagining how human-dragon communication might be possible. They return with missing eyes or minds, physical and psychological damage that serves as evidence of what actually happens when humans attempt to interact with dragons as equals rather than accepting their position as inferior beings, whose survival depends on avoiding attention. The missing eyes suggest that dragons respond to direct visual contact as a form of challenge or threat that requires immediate correction. The damaged minds indicate that exposure to dragon consciousness produces psychological trauma that exceeds human capacity for processing and integration. The survivors of these failed contact attempts rarely provide useful information about their experiences, not because they're unwilling to share what they learned, but because the trauma of dragon encounter often damages the parts of their brains responsible for memory formation and verbal communication. They return as cautionary examples rather than as sources of knowledge about dragon nature or guidance for future attempts at communication. One man claimed he rode a dragon, traveling through territories that would have been impossible to cross on foot and observing the world from perspectives that only aerial creatures could achieve. His account includes details about the sensation of dragon flight, descriptions of landscape features that can only be seen from great heights, and claims about dragon behavior during activities that no ground-based human could witness. He hasn't spoken since. The experience, whatever it actually involved, seems to have overwhelmed his ability to process and communicate information about normal human activities. He responds to direct questions with gestures and expressions that suggest he understands what's being asked but cannot or will not provide verbal responses. His silence might indicate that dragon consciousness is simply too alien for human minds to process without permanent damage. Or it might suggest that he learned something about dragon nature that cannot be safely shared with other humans. The man's condition serves as a living reminder that even if dragon bonding were possible, the human cost might exceed any benefits that such relationships could provide. His presence in the community creates a form of uncomfortable hope, evidence that humans might be capable of surviving direct contact with dragons, but also evidence that such survival might require sacrificing the essential human characteristics that make survival worthwhile. The persistence of bonding myths reflects humanity's inability to accept their new position in the natural hierarchy without continuing to search for escape routes that might restore their sense of agency and importance. These myths provide psychological comfort during the darkest periods of struggle, but they also encourage dangerous behaviors that result in casualties that communities can't afford to lose. The reality that underlies all these stories is that dragons remain fundamentally alien, operating according to motivations and logic that human minds cannot penetrate or influence. The dream of partnership represents a refusal to accept that humans have become minor characters in a story where they once believed themselves to be the protagonists, bit players in a drama that continues to unfold without regard for their preferences or survival needs. The refusal to accept your minor role in this dragon-dominated drama becomes harder to maintain as each day draws to a close and you're forced to confront the simple fact that you've survived another 12 hours in a world that seems designed to eliminate human presence entirely. The end of a normal day in this environment doesn't bring the satisfaction of accomplishment or the peaceful transition into rest that once marked the rhythm of human life, but rather a cautious relief that you've managed to avoid catastrophe for one more cycle of daylight and darkness. You return home with the same careful attention to your surroundings that governed your movements throughout the day, scanning the sky for signs of dragon activity, listening for the sounds that might indicate changes in the local threat level, and checking for evidence that your shelter has been disturbed during your absence. The approach to your dwelling is never casual or automatic, because the building that provided safety when you left might no longer exist, or might now shelter creatures that have learned to associate human habitation with opportunities for easy prey. If your shelter is still standing, the sight of intact walls and an undisturbed entrance creates a moment of gratitude that would have seemed absurd in the previous world, when the continued existence of your home was something you took for granted, rather than something that required daily verification. The small structure that serves as your protection against the elements and concealment from aerial observation represents a victory against forces that could have destroyed it as easily as breathing, and its survival through another day feels like a minor miracle rather than a normal occurrence. You breathe when you see those familiar walls, not the deep, relieved sigh that might attract attention, but a small, internal acknowledgement that you've been granted another night of relative safety. The breathing is careful and controlled, because even the sound of relief might carry farther than you intend, and because maintaining emotional discipline becomes automatic when survival depends on never allowing yourself to relax completely. Neighbors glance at you as you make your way through the community spaces that separate individual shelters, their eyes conducting the same quick assessment that you perform when you see them, still alive, still functional, still contributing to the collective survival effort that keeps everyone breathing for another day. The glances are brief and subtle, because prolonged eye contact creates the kind of social interaction that might develop into conversations, and conversations create noise that could attract unwanted attention. The unspoken question in these brief visual exchanges is always the same: still alive? The answer, communicated through posture, movement patterns, and the simple fact of your presence, provides reassurance that the community has survived another day without losing essential members to the various forms of sudden death that constitute the primary threat to group survival. Each person who returns safely to their shelter represents proof that the survival strategies developed by the community continue to function effectively. Good, the neighbors think, allowing themselves a moment of satisfaction that their own survival odds have been slightly improved by your continued existence. Community wellness checks have been simplified to still breathing and all limbs accounted for. In a world where every person's knowledge and capabilities contribute to the group's ability to detect and respond to threats, the loss of any community member weakens everyone else's chances of surviving future encounters with danger. Dinner is cold, not because cooking fuel is unavailable or because you lack the skills necessary to prepare hot meals, but because the heat, light, and smoke associated with cooking fires create exactly the kinds of environmental signals that might attract the attention of creatures, whose curiosity about human activities often proves fatal for the humans involved. The cold meal is another compromise between human comfort and survival necessity, a daily reminder that the basic activities that once defined normal human existence have become luxuries that few people can afford. The food itself might be the same ingredients that you would have eaten warm in the previous world, but consuming them cold changes both the sensory experience and the psychological impact of eating. Cold food provides calories and nutrition, but lacks the comfort and satisfaction that humans associate with properly prepared meals, making every dinner a small reminder of everything that has been lost to accommodate the realities of living in a dragon-ruled environment. Fire attracts attention, not just from dragons, but from all the smaller predators and scavengers that have learned to associate human cooking fires with opportunities to find food, shelter, or prey. The light from fires can be seen from great distances, especially in environments where most human activity happens under cover or in concealment. The smoke carries scents that announce human presence to creatures whose survival strategies involve tracking and hunting the beings that now represent potential food sources rather than apex predators. You sleep lightly because deep sleep requires a level of trust in your environment's safety that simply doesn't exist when dragons rule the sky and smaller threats move through the darkness between human shelters. Your nervous system has adapted to function on the minimal rest that comes from brief periods of unconsciousness, interrupted by frequent returns to alertness as your brain processes the continuous stream of sensory information that might indicate approaching danger. The sleep you do achieve rarely includes dreams of peace or comfort, but instead features scenarios based on the various types of encounters that you might face during your waking hours. Your unconscious mind uses sleep time to process survival information, to rehearse appropriate responses to different categories of threats, and to work through the psychological stress that accumulates from living in constant proximity to forces that could end your existence without warning. Every wing beat in the distance makes your heart stutter, jolting you from whatever rest you've managed to achieve back into the hyperalert state that has become your default mental condition. The sound might indicate a dragon passing through your area on its way to other territories, or it might suggest that something has taken an interest in the local environment and is conducting the kind of investigation that often precedes more intensive interaction with human settlements. Your heart responds to these sounds with the same physiological stress patterns that once activated only during genuine emergencies, but which now constitute the normal background state of your cardiovascular system. The constant activation of stress responses creates long-term health consequences that would have been considered serious medical conditions in the previous world, but which now represent the standard physical cost of survival in an environment where relaxation could prove fatal. Sleep becomes impossible until enough time has passed to suggest that whatever caused the sound has moved on to other areas or returned to whatever activities occupy dragons when they're not investigating potential sources of human presence. The night continues with more sounds, more moments of alertness, more brief periods of rest interrupted by the environmental audio that has replaced alarm clocks as the primary factor determining your sleep schedule. Morning will come eventually, bringing another day of careful movement, quiet work, and constant vigilance that will end with another evening of cold food and interrupted sleep. The cycle of interrupted sleep and constant vigilance that defines your nights in the dragon world stands in stark contrast to the experience you're having right now, as you listen to these words in the safety of your actual environment. Morning will come for you without the need to check whether your shelter survived the night, without scanning the sky for threats, without the careful listening that determines whether the sounds you hear represent normal environmental activity or approaching danger that requires immediate response. The contrast between these two realities, the brutal survival requirements of a dragon-ruled world and the casual safety of your current existence, becomes more apparent as you consider the simple luxuries that surround you in this moment. Soft sheets that you can pull around your body without worrying about whether their texture or color might attract unwanted attention. Clean water flowing freely from taps that respond to your touch, providing unlimited quantities of liquid that doesn't carry the taste of ash or the chemical contamination that makes every drink a calculated risk. Warm light that illuminates your space at the touch of a switch, without the smoke and fire that would announce your presence to creatures hunting for signs of human activity. The light is clean and controllable, providing exactly the illumination you need without creating the environmental signatures that could prove fatal in a world where visibility equals vulnerability. No watchmen patrol the boundaries of your community, because your community doesn't require protection from aerial predators whose casual movements could reshape the landscape and eliminate human settlements without malicious intent. The absence of sentries represents a form of safety so complete that you rarely think about it. A security so reliable that you can focus your attention on concerns that extend far beyond the immediate requirements of staying alive from one moment to the next. No ash storms darken your sky or contaminate your air, because your atmosphere isn't filled with the byproducts of creatures whose very existence alters the chemical composition of everything they encounter. You breathe without filtering, without rationing, without the careful shallow respiration that minimizes exposure to particulates that could damage your lungs or introduce toxins into your bloodstream. No distant roars interrupt your sleep or require you to implement emergency protocols, designed to help you survive encounters with forces that operate according to rules you can observe but never understand. The sounds that reach you during the night are predictable and benign: traffic, weather, the normal audio environment of a world where the most dangerous creatures are small enough that humans remain the dominant species. You are safe now, but only because you're not there, only because the dragons that rule that other world have no presence in yours. Your safety is not the result of superior survival skills or better preparation for dealing with existential threats, but simply the accident of geography and circumstance that places you in an environment where such threats don't exist. The recognition of this safety, when you pause to consider it directly, creates a form of gratitude that would be difficult to access without the contrast provided by imagining life under different conditions. The simple fact that you can lie down without checking for signs of structural damage to your shelter, that you can eat warm food without worrying about attracting predators, that you can speak at normal volume without fear of being overheard by creatures that might interpret human voices as indicators of prey, represents a collection of privileges so fundamental that they usually remain invisible. Say thank you for plumbing, for the infrastructure that brings clean water into your living space and removes waste without requiring you to venture into environments where exposure to contaminated materials could cause illness or death. The systems that maintain your sanitation operate reliably and invisibly, providing services that support human health and comfort without requiring daily attention or constant maintenance under dangerous conditions. For roofs that protect you from weather that follows predictable patterns and consists of materials that won't burn your skin or damage your possessions. Your shelter doesn't need to be camouflaged or reinforced against attacks from above, because nothing in your environment poses the kinds of threats that would require such precautions. The roof over your head represents security rather than mere concealment. For silence, perhaps the most precious luxury of all in a world where unnecessary sound could attract fatal attention. You live in an environment where you can laugh loudly, play music, engage in conversations that serve no survival purpose, and express emotions without calculating whether the noise you're making might compromise your safety or the safety of everyone around you. The silence available to you is not the tense, fearful silence of people hiding from predators, but the peaceful quiet that comes from living in an environment where the most dangerous thing you're likely to encounter can be addressed through normal social institutions rather than personal survival skills. Police, hospitals, emergency services, all of these represent collective, human responses to danger that eliminate the need for individuals to develop the hypervigilance and rapid threat assessment that characterize life in environments where such institutions cannot exist. Your biggest concerns tonight might involve work deadlines, relationship issues, financial planning, or entertainment choices. Problems that would seem absurdly trivial to someone whose primary concern is avoiding detection by creatures that could eliminate them without effort or malice. Complaining about slow internet speeds is a luxury available only to species that don't have to worry about whether their bandwidth will attract something with wings. But these concerns represent the luxury of being able to focus on improving your life rather than simply maintaining your existence. The complexity of your problems reflects the safety and stability of your environment. Only people who don't need to worry about immediate survival can afford to develop anxiety about career advancement, social status, or personal fulfillment. Your ability to be concerned about anything other than basic physical safety represents a form of privilege that becomes apparent only when contrasted with conditions where such concerns become impossible to maintain. The warmth that surrounds you, whether from heating systems, warm clothing, or simply the absence of environmental conditions that constantly drain heat from your body, exists without effort on your part, maintained by systems that operate reliably without requiring you to understand their function or contribute to their maintenance. You exist in a bubble of controlled environment that protects you from the harsh realities that govern survival in less hospitable conditions. This warmth extends beyond physical comfort to encompass the psychological warmth that comes from living in predictable circumstances, where you can make plans that extend beyond the immediate future, and where your efforts to improve your situation have reasonable chances of success. The emotional climate in which you exist allows for hope, ambition, love, and creativity in ways that become impossible when all available psychological resources must be devoted to threat detection and immediate survival. So settle back into that comfort, not just the physical comfort of your immediate surroundings, but the vast, complex comfort of living in a world where human civilization has achieved enough control over environmental threats to allow individuals to pursue goals that extend far beyond mere survival. Feel the safety that surrounds you like an invisible shield, protecting you from dangers that don't exist in your reality, but which define every moment of existence for people living under different conditions. The dragons are not waiting for you, at least, not tonight. Not in this room behind these walls under this particular sky that remains empty of wings. Whether they're sleeping somewhere distant, or whether they never found their way to this version of the world, or whether they're simply waiting for conditions you can't predict, that remains a question without an answer. But for now, in this moment, you are safe in the space between their presence and your rest.